Some questions don't have answers. Some disappearances leave no trace. Some events unfold without explanation, and stay that way for centuries. Throughout human history, there are moments so strange, so unsettling, that even our most brilliant minds have walked away silent. What happened to civilizations that vanished overnight? Who left markings in stone that no language can decode? What did witnesses see that they couldn't explain and wouldn't forget? These aren't legends. These are documented, real, and deeply unresolved. So settle in, stay close, and let's uncover them together. Somewhere in the dry, sun-baked earth of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, archaeologists uncovered something that stopped them cold. Small rectangular tablets, carved from steatite, a soft stone the color of cream and ash, each no larger than a postage stamp. On their faces, animals rendered with striking precision. A short-horned bull, a one-horned creature that some have called a unicorn, an elephant, standing still and dignified, and above each animal, a row of symbols. Neat, deliberate, completely unreadable. These are the seals of the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the ancient world's most sophisticated cultures, flourishing between roughly 3300 and 1300 BC along the fertile plains of the Indus River. At its peak, this civilization stretched across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa among them, were engineering marvels: grid-planned streets, advanced drainage systems, standardized brick sizes. A society that clearly valued order, precision, and complexity. And yet, we cannot read a single word they left behind. Over 4,000 of these seals have been discovered to date. The script they carry, known simply as the Indus script, contains somewhere between 400 and 600 distinct signs. That range itself is telling. Scholars still debate the exact count. Some signs appear frequently, others surface only once. There are short inscriptions and slightly longer ones, but none that run more than 26 symbols in sequence. No lengthy texts, no bilingual inscriptions like the Rosetta Stone that helped crack Egyptian hieroglyphics. Nothing to anchor meaning to language. Without that anchor, every attempt at translation has remained, at best, a hypothesis. The mainstream academic position is cautious and measured. The script likely represented an early form of language, possibly related to a Proto-Dravidian tongue spoken across South Asia before the migrations of later millennia. Computational analysis of the script's internal patterns suggests it followed grammatical rules, that it wasn't simply decorative or purely numerical. It behaves, statistically, like a writing system. But behavior isn't meaning. Then there are the more unconventional voices. Some researchers have proposed the script was never a full language at all, that it functioned more like a logo system, encoding names, titles, or trade identities rather than spoken words. A kind of ancient branding. The seals, after all, were likely used to stamp goods and mark ownership. Perhaps they weren't meant to be read aloud. Perhaps they were never meant to tell a story. Others have gone further still. A handful of independent researchers, working outside traditional academic institutions, have claimed partial translations, linking the symbols to early Vedic Sanskrit, to Sumerian, even to a proto-global writing system they believe connected ancient civilizations across continents. These claims have not gained acceptance in mainstream scholarship, but they persist. And in the absence of a definitive answer, persistence carries its own quiet weight. What makes the Indus script so uniquely haunting is not just that it's undeciphered, it's that the civilization behind it vanished with almost equal mystery. Around 1900 BC, the great urban centers began to decline. Population shifted, cities emptied, climate change, river disruption, migration. Theories abound, but no single explanation fully satisfies. A civilization that built some of the ancient world's most advanced cities simply dissolved. And the language they used to communicate, to trade, to record whatever it was they needed to record. It went with them. Thousands of years later, we hold their seals in our hands. We study the symbols under magnification. We run them through algorithms. We compare, cross-reference, hypothesize, and still the seals say nothing, or perhaps everything, in a voice we simply haven't learned to hear. The Indus Valley left us symbols we cannot read, a civilization that spoke in a language still locked from us. But sometimes, history doesn't hide its secrets in writing. Sometimes, it buries them. Literally. In the summer of 1986, construction workers digging near the city of Guanghan in Sichuan province, China, struck something unexpected. Two large pits, cut deep into the earth, filled with objects unlike anything Chinese archaeology had encountered before. Bronze masks with eyes that protruded outward like telescopes, stretching several inches beyond the face as though straining to see something beyond human vision. Enormous trees cast in bronze, their branches hung with jade ornaments and tiny birds. A standing figure nearly 2.5 meters tall, the largest bronze human statue from the ancient world, its hands formed into a strange, hollow grip, as if holding something that had long since disappeared. Elephant tusks by the hundreds, jade blades, gold foil shaped into the form of a human face, and underneath it all, ash. Everything had been burned. This was Sanxingdui, and no one had any idea it existed. The site sits in the Chengdu Plain, a region of southwestern China that was believed for most of modern history to have been a cultural backwater during China's Bronze Age, a peripheral zone, distant from the great river civilizations that defined early Chinese history along the Yellow River. Official histories from ancient China made no meaningful mention of an advanced culture here. No records, no legends specific enough to point to this place. But Sanxingdui rewrote that assumption entirely. Radiocarbon dating placed the artifacts between approximately 1700 and 1100 BC, contemporary with China's Shang dynasty, one of the most celebrated periods in early Chinese civilization. Yet the objects found at Sanxingdui bore almost no resemblance to Shang art or symbolism. The Shang favored specific animal motifs, ritual bronze vessels of particular shapes, a visual language deeply rooted in their cosmology. Sanxingdui had its own visual language entirely, one that scholars had never seen before. The civilization responsible is now called the Shu Kingdom, or the Sanxingdui culture. It appears to have been a major Bronze Age society, capable of extraordinary artistic and technical achievement. Its bronze casting was, by any measure, remarkable. Some of the artifacts required metallurgical knowledge and organizational capacity that implied a sophisticated, well-resourced society. And yet, like the Indus Valley before it, the Shu Kingdom left no deciphered written records, no texts explaining who they were, no accounts of their rulers, their wars, their gods. Nothing but the objects themselves, placed carefully, burned deliberately, and buried. The question is, why? Archaeologists generally describe the pits as sacrificial or ritual deposits. The burning and burial of valuable objects is a practice found across many ancient cultures, a way of offering precious things to gods or ancestors, of marking a significant transition, of consecrating a space. This explanation is reasonable. It is grounded in comparative archaeology. It fits the evidence in broad terms. But it doesn't explain the specificity of what was buried. The bronze masks in particular have drawn sustained attention. The protruding eyes, some extending nearly 16 centimeters outward, appear repeatedly across Sanxingdui's artifacts. Ancient Chinese texts do contain a fragmentary reference to an early Shu ruler named Kan Kong, described as having vertical eyes. For generations, scholars dismissed this as poetic metaphor. After Sanxingdui, some began to wonder if it was something else entirely. A memory, however distorted, of a real visual tradition. A people who mythologize their own appearance, or the appearance of their divine figures, into something beyond human proportion. Others have proposed the eyes represented a different kind of vision. Spiritual sight, the ability to perceive realms invisible to ordinary humans. The masks on this reading were not portraits. They were instruments, objects designed to embody a capacity for seeing across boundaries. Then there are those who have pushed further into speculation, noting that Sangsingdui shares no clear cultural lineage with surrounding civilizations, that its sudden emergence and apparent equally sudden disappearance around 1100 BC remain poorly explained, and that the destroyed and buried artifacts suggest not a ritual conclusion, but something more abrupt. A rupture. Some have proposed invasion, or internal collapse, or environmental catastrophe along the Min River. None of these theories have achieved consensus. And in more fringe corners of the conversation, the alien-like appearance of the bronze figures has attracted a different kind of theorizing altogether. One that mainstream archaeology firmly sets aside, but which persists in popular imagination nonetheless. It is worth noting only because it reflects something real. These objects are genuinely strange enough that even trained archaeologists encountering them for the first time have described a sense of profound disorientation. In 2020 and 2021, new excavations at Sangsingdui resumed after decades of limited work. 6 additional sacrificial pits were identified. More bronze figures emerged from the earth. More elephant tusks. More ash. Among the new finds, a bronze figure with a bird's body and a human face, its expression calm, its meaning entirely unknown. The site, researchers now believe, may be far larger than originally thought. Much of it remains unexcavated. So here is where we are. A Bronze Age civilization of extraordinary sophistication, flourishing for centuries in a region history forgot, producing art of haunting and alien beauty, destroying and burying its most sacred objects for reasons we can only theorize, and then vanishing, leaving behind no language we can read and no memory that survived into the cultures that came after. The pits were sealed for 3,000 years. We have opened them. We have cataloged what was inside. But the silence at the center of Sangsingdui remains undisturbed. What were they trying to send forward through time? And what did they decide, in the end, to keep from us? We have seen civilizations leave objects behind, seals carved with symbols no one can read, bronze figures buried in ash-filled pits. But what happens when a civilization doesn't just leave objects behind? What happens when it leaves everything behind? Streets, wells, homes, granaries, an entire city, intact and empty. Mohenjo-Daro sits in what is now the Sindh province of Pakistan, rising from a flat, sun-bleached plain along the western bank of the Indus River. From a distance, it looks like a series of low mounds. The earth slowly reclaiming what was once one of the most sophisticated urban centers the ancient world had ever produced. But walk closer, and the city begins to reveal itself. Wide, straight streets laid out on a precise grid. Brick homes with private bathing areas and drainage systems that channeled waste away from living quarters. A structure archaeologists call the Great Bath. A large, watertight pool at the center of the city, its purpose still debated, its construction still impressive. Public buildings, storage facilities, a citadel elevated above the lower city, watching over it all. At its height, somewhere around 2500 BC, Mohenjo-Daro may have housed between 40,000 and 80,000 people. It was not a village or a modest settlement. It was a city in the fullest sense, planned, managed, and sustained by a society that clearly understood civic organization at a level that would not reappear in the region for centuries. And then, gradually, it emptied. The decline of Mohenjo-Daro appears to have unfolded slowly, beginning around 1900 BC. Archaeological layers from the city's final centuries show signs of stress, overcrowding in some areas, a decline in the quality of construction, buildings subdivided into smaller and smaller units as if more people were pressing into less space. The careful urban planning that defined the city's earlier centuries began to erode. Streets narrowed with improvised structures. The drainage systems fell into disrepair. Something was changing. Something was pressing in. The most widely accepted explanation among scholars centers on environmental transformation. The Indus River, which sustained Mohenjo-Daro's agriculture and water supply, is believed to have shifted course over time, a process driven by tectonic activity and natural river migration. As the river moved, the agricultural land that fed the city may have become less reliable. Seasonal flooding, which in earlier centuries likely deposited fertile silt across the plains, may have become unpredictable or destructive. Some researchers have also pointed to a broader pattern of aridification across the region, a gradual drying of the climate that affected not just Mohenjo-Daro, but the entire Indus Valley civilization simultaneously. On this reading, the city was not abandoned in a single dramatic moment. It was slowly surrendered, population by population, neighborhood by neighborhood, as the conditions that made it viable quietly disappeared. But then there are the skeletons. In the upper levels of Mohenjo-Daro, the layers corresponding to the city's final period, archaeologists discovered something that didn't fit neatly into the gradual decline narrative. Clusters of human skeletons, some found in the streets, some in rooms, some grouped together as if they had fallen where they stood. Several showed signs of violent trauma. They were left unburied, which in most ancient cultures represents a profound departure from normal practice. These were not people given ceremonial burial. These were people who died. And for whatever reason, no one came back to enter them. What does that mean? It could mean the city's population had already largely departed by the time these individuals died, leaving no one to perform burial rites. It could mean the final days of Mohenjo-Daro were chaotic, marked by violence or disease or both. It could mean something arrived faster than anyone could respond to. The question of what that something was has generated significant debate. Some scholars have proposed that incursions from outside groups, possibly early Indo-Aryan migrations moving southward through the passes of Central Asia, contributed to the destabilization of Indus Valley cities. This remains contested. The archaeological evidence for large-scale violent conquest at Mohenjo-Daro is limited, and many researchers argue the skeletal remains represent isolated incidents rather than systematic destruction. The decline on this view was still fundamentally environmental and demographic rather than military. Others have looked at the skeletal evidence differently. A small number of researchers, working from analyses of bone composition and site stratigraphy, have proposed that some form of epidemic disease may have swept through the city's final population. Dense urban environments, compromised water systems, and a population already under stress from environmental disruption would have created conditions in which disease could move quickly and lethally. And then, there are the theories that sit at the furthest edge of the conversation. The ones mainstream archaeology does not entertain, but popular fascination refuses to release. In the 1970s, a researcher named David Davenport proposed that certain areas of Mohenjo-Daro showed evidence of extreme, localized heat, vitrified soil, and fused pottery suggesting temperatures far beyond what ordinary fire could produce. He interpreted this as evidence of an ancient catastrophic event of unknown origin. His analysis has been disputed and largely rejected by the scientific community, which attributes the fused materials to more conventional kilns and burning. But the idea persisted, circulating through decades of alternative history literature. What makes Mohenjo-Daro so enduring as a mystery is not any single unanswered question. It is the accumulation of them. A city of remarkable sophistication, planned and functioning for centuries, declining and emptying over a period that feels both gradual and abrupt. No clear successor culture that claimed its legacy. No texts explaining what happened from the perspective of those who lived through it. Only the grid of streets, the silent wells, and the bones of those last inhabitants, left where they fell, in a city that had already begun to forget them. We can measure the bricks. We can map the drainage channels. We can date the ash layers. But the last morning in Mohenjo-Daro, what its people saw, what they feared, what made them finally leave or made it impossible to stay, that morning remains beyond our reach. And the city holds it still. Mohenjo-Daro was abandoned in silence, its streets emptied, its wells left open, its last residents leaving no written account of what drove them away. But not every lost civilization disappears into dust and dry plains. Some vanish into the sea, or rather, into the island the sea surrounds. Crete sits at the southern edge of the Aegean, a long, narrow island suspended between Europe, Africa, and the Near East. For most casual students of history, it is known primarily through myth. The labyrinth, the Minotaur, the thread that Theseus followed back to light. But beneath the mythology lies something far more interesting and considerably less understood. A real civilization, thriving for over 1,000 years, that we are only beginning to comprehend. The Minoans, named not by themselves but by the archaeologist Arthur Evans, who excavated their palace at Knossos in the early 20th century, flourished on Crete from roughly 2700 to 1450 BC. They were a maritime people, their wealth built on trade across the Aegean and Mediterranean. Their art was vivid and naturalistic in a way that feels almost modern. Dolphins leaping across painted walls, young figures vaulting over the backs of bulls, women in elaborate tiered dresses gathered in what appear to be ceremonial spaces. They built palace complexes of extraordinary sophistication, with running water, light wells, and multi-story architecture. They had a writing system, two, in fact. One, called Linear A, remains completely undeciphered to this day. And they watched the sky. The evidence for Minoan astronomical knowledge is subtle, embedded, and deeply debated. It does not come in the form of stone observatories or inscribed star catalogs. It comes instead through architecture, artifact, and alignment, and through the slow, painstaking work of researchers who have spent careers asking whether the patterns they observe are intentional or coincidental. At the Palace of Knossos and at several other Minoan sites, researchers have noted architectural alignments that correspond to significant solar and lunar events. Doorways and corridors oriented toward the rising sun at solstice. Courtyards positioned to capture specific light at specific times of year. Whether these alignments were deliberate astronomical engineering or the byproduct of other practical and aesthetic considerations remains genuinely uncertain. But the pattern, across multiple sites, is consistent enough to sustain the question. More specific claims have emerged from the study of Minoan artifacts. Certain seal stones and painted vessels carry arrangements of dots, circles, and geometric forms that some researchers have proposed represent star clusters. The Pleiades, in particular, a constellation of enormous importance to ancient Mediterranean agricultural calendars. The Pleiades mark the beginning of the sailing season, the timing of harvests, the rhythm of the agricultural year across dozens of ancient cultures. If the Minoans encoded this constellation into their decorative objects, they were doing something that connected them to a vast web of ancient astronomical tradition. But here is where the evidence becomes harder to hold with confidence. Linear A, the Minoan writing system that preceded and likely influenced the later Linear B script used by Mycenaean Greeks, has not been decoded. Linear B was cracked in 1952 by architect Michael Ventris, revealing it as an early form of Greek. Linear A shares some of the same symbols, but the language beneath it appears to be something else entirely. Something unrelated to any language family scholars have yet been able to identify with certainty. What the Minoans wrote, what they recorded, what knowledge they committed to clay tablets and stone, we cannot read it. Which means that even if they possessed systematic astronomical knowledge, calendrical systems, navigational star maps, records of celestial cycles, we would have no direct access to it. It would be there in the undeciphered tablets, waiting. Some researchers have approached this silence from a different angle. Comparative analysis of later Greek astronomical and navigational traditions has led a small number of scholars to propose that certain elements of early Greek sky knowledge, constellations, seasonal markers, navigational star paths, may have been inherited or adapted from Minoan sources. The Minoans were, after all, accomplished sailors operating across the same waters that later Greek navigators would chart. Knowledge of the stars was not abstract for a seafaring people. It was survival. It was the difference between finding the harbor and losing the ship. Whether that knowledge was sophisticated enough to constitute what we might recognize as star maps, systematic, intentional representations of the night sky designed for navigation or calendrical use, is something the current evidence cannot confirm. but it cannot dismiss it either. Then there is the question of what ended the Minoans, or more precisely, what ended them so completely that their writing went with them, undeciphered and untransmitted. Around 1450 BC, Minoan civilization collapsed with a suddenness that still generates scholarly debate. The eruption of the Thera volcano on the island now known as Santorini, roughly 110 kilometers north of Crete, is frequently cited as a contributing factor. The eruption was among the largest in recorded human history, sending tsunamis across the Aegean and blanketing the region in ash. Whether it directly caused the Minoan collapse or weakened the civilization enough for Mycenaean Greeks to move in and take over remains contested. What is clear is that after 1450 BC, Linear A disappears. The Minoan administrative and cultural apparatus dissolves. A different people, writing a different script, occupy the palaces of Crete. And whatever the Minoans knew about the stars, about the sea, about the patterns they traced in the night sky above the Aegean, it did not survive the transition in any form we can yet recover. Somewhere in those undeciphered tablets, stacked in palace storerooms that burned or were buried or simply ceased to be maintained, there may be records of a sky that Minoan sailors memorized on open water 3,500 years ago. We have the tablets. We have the symbols. We just don't have the key. The Minoans left us tablets we cannot read and alignments we cannot fully explain, a civilization that slipped beneath the weight of time, leaving only fragments of a knowledge system we may never fully reconstruct. But what if a civilization didn't just disappear from history? What if it disappeared beneath the water itself? Not metaphorically, not gradually, physically, completely, and without explanation. Lake Fuxian lies in Yunnan province, in the southwestern corner of China, a region of extraordinary geographical complexity, where plateaus collapse into river valleys and ancient trade routes once threaded between cultures that rarely appear in mainstream historical narratives. The lake itself is striking. It is one of the deepest freshwater lakes in China. Its water unusually clear, its surface calm in a way that feels less like tranquility and more like concealment. Local communities have lived along its shores for centuries, and for just as long, they have carried stories of lights beneath the water, of structures glimpsed by divers, of a city that the lake swallowed whole. For most of the 20th century, those stories were treated as folklore. Then, in 2001, a Chinese diver named Geng Wei descended into the lake's depths and came back with something that changed the conversation entirely. What he found, and what subsequent expeditions have continued to document, are stone structures on the lake floor. Large, flat-surface stones arranged with a regularity that does not resemble natural formation. Walls, what appear to be paved roads, platforms, structures that extend across a considerable area of the lake bottom, sitting at depths ranging from roughly 6 to 20 meters below the surface. Some of the stones are estimated to weigh several tons. Their surfaces in places show what researchers have described as tool marks, evidence of deliberate shaping. The structures cover an area that some estimates place at close to 2.5 square kilometers. If accurate, that is not a small outpost or a ceremonial platform. That is a settlement of meaningful scale. The immediate question is obvious. How did it get there? The geological explanation most frequently offered is tectonic subsidence. Yunnan province sits in a seismically active zone where the Indian subcontinent continues its slow collision with the Eurasian plate, pushing up the Tibetan plateau and generating significant geological instability across the region. It is entirely plausible, geologically speaking, that land once above the lake's waterline sank over time as a result of seismic activity, taking whatever stood on it down with it. Lake levels in the region have also fluctuated over millennia due to climatic and hydrological changes. A combination of land subsidence and rising water could, theoretically, submerge a substantial settlement without any single catastrophic event. But the details resist easy resolution. Local historical records, fragmentary and difficult to date with precision, contain references to an ancient kingdom in the Fuxian region known as Guyun. The records describe it as a significant political and cultural center that disappeared from the historical record abruptly, without the kind of narrative explanation that usually accompanies the fall of an important state. No conquest is clearly recorded, no migration, no natural disaster specific enough to anchor the account. The kingdom appears, functions, and then simply ceases to be mentioned. Whether the structures beneath the lake are the physical remains of Guyun is not established. Radiocarbon dating of organic material associated with the site has produced estimates placing human activity in the area at least 2,000 years ago, with some suggestions of even earlier occupation. But the dating is complicated by the underwater environment, and the structural remains themselves have not yet been subjected to the kind of comprehensive archaeological analysis that would be required to make definitive claims about their age or origin. What has been documented more recently has deepened rather than resolved the mystery. Underwater expeditions in the years following Geng Wei's initial discovery have mapped additional features, including what appears to be a large circular structure that some researchers have cautiously compared to a ceremonial or civic space. Carvings on certain stones remain under analysis. The full extent of the submerged area has not been comprehensively surveyed, in part because of the depth, the visibility conditions, and the logistical complexity of sustained underwater archaeology in a remote inland lake. Then there are the local accounts that sit outside the archaeological record entirely. Residents along the lake shores have described, over generations, seeing unusual lights moving beneath the surface. Not reflections, not bioluminescence, but organized points of light that appear and disappear. Fishermen have reported their equipment behaving anomalously in certain areas of the lake, compasses giving inconsistent readings, engines cutting out without mechanical explanation. These accounts are anecdotal and unverified. They are not evidence of anything specific, but they form a layer of local knowledge that has persisted independently of the archaeological discoveries, which makes them, at minimum, interesting. More speculative researchers have proposed that Lake Fuxian may sit above geological features that generate unusual electromagnetic conditions, which could explain both the compass anomalies and, potentially, contribute to the lake's extraordinary clarity, its water being filtered through unique mineral substrates. None of this has been rigorously tested in relation to the submerged structures. What remains is this: a deep, clear lake in one of China's most geologically complex regions. Hiding beneath its surface the stone remains of what appears to be a substantial human settlement, associated with a historical kingdom whose disappearance was never properly explained, in a part of the world where the deep history of human civilization is still being written. The water above it is perfectly still. The structures below have been there for at least 2,000 years, possibly longer, waiting with the particular patience of things that have already outlasted everyone who might have explained them. What was Guyun? Who built what lies beneath that water? And what, if anything, do the lights that local people have watched moving in the deep have to do with any of it? The lake is not telling. Beneath Lake Fuxian, stone walls sit in silence at the bottom of water that has kept its secrets for at least 2,000 years. We can dive to them. We can photograph them, but we cannot yet read what they mean. It is a particular kind of frustration, to be so close to something and still so far from understanding it. But sometimes, history offers the opposite problem entirely. Sometimes we have the words. We have thousands upon thousands of words. And the mystery persists anyway. Tel Mardik is a low, unremarkable mound rising from the flat, dry plain of northwestern Syria, roughly 50 kilometers south of Aleppo. From a distance, it looks like little more than a geological irregularity, a slight swelling in the earth that a traveler might pass without a second glance. The landscape around it is sparse and sun-hardened, the kind of terrain that gives away nothing. But in 1964, Italian archaeologists from the University of Rome began excavating this mound, and what they uncovered over the following decades would force historians to rewrite their understanding of the ancient Near East entirely. Beneath the dust of Tel Mardik lay Ibla, a city that had been, at its height around 2400 to 2300 BC, one of the most powerful urban centers in the ancient world. a kingdom of perhaps 250,000 people at the peak of its regional influence, controlling trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, managing a commercial network that stretched across hundreds of kilometers of ancient Syria and beyond. Ebla produced textiles that were traded across the known world. It negotiated treaties with other great powers. It maintained a professional administrative class, a standing military, and a palace complex of considerable scale and sophistication. And it kept records. In 1974 and 1975, excavators uncovered what remains one of the most remarkable archival discoveries in the history of archaeology: the Royal Archives of Ebla. Approximately 17,000 clay tablets and fragments, stacked in the remains of a palace storeroom, preserving the administrative, commercial, diplomatic, and literary life of a city that had been forgotten for 4,000 years. The tablets were written in two languages: Sumerian, the dominant administrative language of the ancient Near East, and Eblate, a previously unknown Semitic language that the discovery itself brought to light for the first time. Scholars could read them. And what they read was extraordinary: trade ledgers, diplomatic correspondence, mythological texts, lists of gods, lists of places, records of grain and silver and cloth moving through a commercial system of genuine complexity. Here was a civilization that had not vanished without a trace. It had left an archive, and yet Ebla still collapsed, twice, in ways that the archive, for all its detail, does not fully explain. The first destruction came around 2300 BC. The palace burned. The archives ironically survived because the fire that destroyed the wooden shelving baked the clay tablets hard, preserving them far better than they might otherwise have been. Archaeologists believe this destruction was the work of Sargon of Akkad, or possibly his grandson Naram-Sin, the great Akkadian conquerors who swept through Syria and Mesopotamia during this period, dismantling competing power centers with systematic efficiency. This first collapse, while devastating, fits within a recognizable historical pattern. Ebla was rebuilt. It recovered, more slowly and at reduced scale, and continued to function as a significant regional city for several more centuries. The second destruction is harder to explain. Around 1600 BC, Ebla collapsed again, this time permanently. The city was burned with an intensity that archaeological layers make plain, a conflagration thorough enough to leave clear evidence across the entire excavated site. And this time, Ebla was not rebuilt. Its population dispersed, its administrative systems dissolved. Its name slowly faded from the records of neighboring civilizations until it disappeared entirely, remembered by no subsequent culture, located by no ancient source precise enough to guide modern archaeologists directly to it. The city had to be rediscovered from scratch, from a mound in a Syrian plain that had forgotten what it was covering. Who destroyed Ebla the second time? The leading candidate in mainstream scholarship is the Hittite king Mursili I, who conducted a famous military campaign through Syria around 1595 BC, sacking the city of Babylon and destabilizing much of the ancient Near East in a single, extraordinarily ambitious sweep. Ebla, sitting on the root of that campaign, may have been one of many cities consumed by the Hittite advance. This explanation is geographically and chronologically plausible, but it is not confirmed. No Hittite text explicitly records the destruction of Ebla, no Eblate tablet, and the archive does not extend to this later period, describes the approach of an enemy or the preparations for a siege. The destruction layer exists. The identity of those who created it does not with certainty exist alongside it. Some researchers have raised the possibility of internal collapse, that Ebla's second fall may have been precipitated as much by internal political fragmentation or economic stress as by external military force. The broader period around 1600 BC was one of widespread instability across the Near East, with trade networks disrupting and power structures shifting in ways that placed pressure on urban centers that depended on regional commerce for their survival. A city weakened from within would have been far more vulnerable to whatever force arrived at its gates. There are also those who have noted, in the archaeological record, evidence of destruction patterns that do not align neatly with military conquest. burned areas that seemed to begin from within the city rather than from its perimeter, suggesting the possibility of internal conflict, fire used as a tool of factional violence rather than foreign invasion. The tablets are silent on all of this. They end centuries before the final destruction, leaving a gap in the record precisely where the most critical events occurred. Ebla gave us 17,000 voices from the ancient world. It gave us a language that no modern scholar had ever heard spoken. It gave us the administrative heartbeat of a civilization in extraordinary detail. And then, at the moment that mattered most, it went quiet. The archive ends. The city burns. And the question of who, finally, extinguished one of the ancient world's most literate civilizations remains, 4,000 years later, genuinely open. Ibla left us 17,000 tablets and still kept its most important secret, the identity of whoever finally extinguished it. A civilization articulate enough to record the price of textiles and the terms of diplomatic treaties, rendered silent at the precise moment its silence matters most. There is something almost deliberate about that, something that feels less like an accident of history and more like a door, closed quietly from the other side. But Ibla, at least, we know existed. We have its archive. We have its name. What do we make of a people who left no name at all, only stones, arranged with a precision that should not have been possible in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth? Nabta Playa is not a place that announces itself. It sits in the eastern Sahara, in what is now the southwestern corner of Egypt, approximately 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, and deep into a landscape that today receives almost no rainfall and sustains almost no life. Flat, pale, featureless at first glance. A dry lake basin surrounded by low desert that stretches in every direction without interruption. The kind of place that empties the mind. The kind of place where, in the present day, almost nothing lives and almost no one goes. Yet here, rising from the desert floor, is a circle of standing stones. And surrounding it, scattered across a wide basin, are alignments of stone slabs and buried megalithic structures of a complexity and intentionality that stopped archaeologists cold when they first encountered them in the 1970s. The site dates to approximately 7,000 to 6,000 BC in its earliest phases of human use, with the stone circle and major megalithic structures constructed somewhere around 5,000 to 4,500 BC. That places Nabta Playa not just before the pyramids. It places it before the civilization that built the pyramids had yet coalesced into recognizable form. It predates Stonehenge by over 1,000 years. It is, by current dating, one of the oldest known astronomically aligned stone structures on Earth. The stone circle at the center of the site contains what researchers have identified as sight lines corresponding to the summer solstice sunrise. The moment in this latitude when the sun rises almost directly north of east, a significant astronomical marker for any society dependent on seasonal cycles. In the hyper-arid Sahara of today, the summer solstice is not agriculturally meaningful. But Nabta Playa was not always desert. Between approximately 11,000 and 5,000 BC, a climatic period known as the African Humid Period, sometimes called the Green Sahara, transformed much of North Africa. Monsoon rains penetrated further north than they do today, filling lake basins, supporting grasslands, enabling the movement of animals and people across terrain that is now empty sand. Nabta Playa during this period was a seasonal lake, filling with water each summer and providing a gathering point for pastoral communities who moved through the region following the rains and the grazing they produced. These were not primitive wanderers. The archaeological record at Nabta Playa reveals complex pottery, organized cattle burials, among the earliest known in the world, and evidence of sustained, structured use of the site across thousands of years. The people who returned here, generation after generation, were maintaining something, preserving something, building something that accumulated meaning and physical scale over an extraordinarily long period of time. The megalithic structures buried beneath the surface of the playa are in some ways more remarkable than the visible stone circle. Large-shaped stones were transported to the site and buried in precise geometric arrangements. Some in alignments that researchers have proposed correspond not just to the solstice, but to specific bright stars as they appeared in the sky 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, accounting for the slow shift of stellar positions caused by the precession of the Earth's axis. If these alignments are intentional, and the debate among researchers is genuine and ongoing, then the people of Nabta Playa possessed a working knowledge of long-term stellar cycles that implies systematic sky observation across multiple generations. Astrophysicist Thomas Brophy, working with archaeologist Fred Wendorf, who led the original excavations, proposed in the early 2000s that certain buried megalithic arrangements at Nabta Playa corresponded with striking precision to the configuration of stars in the constellation Orion as they appeared around 6000 BC. The proposal drew significant attention and equally significant skepticism. Critics pointed out that with enough stones in enough arrangements, correspondences to stellar configurations can be found that may reflect pattern recognition on the part of modern analysts rather than intent on the part of ancient builders. The debate has not been resolved. What is not debated is the sudden end of it all. Around 5000 BC, the African humid period began its long retreat. The monsoon rains pulled back southward. The lake at Nabta Playa stopped refilling. The grasslands dried. The people who had gathered here across millennia, who had buried their cattle with ceremony, erected their stones with precision, returned season after season to a place that clearly held profound significance. Simply stopped coming. They did not leave records of their departure. They did not leave a name by which we could find them in the histories of neighboring cultures. They moved, presumably southward and eastward, following the receding moisture. Some researchers have proposed that the pastoral communities of Nabta Playa were among the ancestral populations that eventually contributed to the formation of Egyptian civilization along the Nile, carrying with them, in diluted or transformed form, astronomical traditions that would resurface in the celestial orientation of Egyptian temples and the religious significance of specific stars. This is speculative but not unreasonable. The timing is consistent. The geography is plausible, the astronomical preoccupations are suggestive, but the people of Nabta Playa themselves, whoever they understood themselves to be, whatever they called the stones they raised and the stars they tracked, dissolved into the drying landscape without a word. They built one of the world's oldest observatories in a place that was already becoming uninhabitable. They oriented it with a precision we are still working to fully understand. And then the desert came, and covered it, and held it for 7,000 years. What were they watching for? And did they find it before the water ran out and the silence began? The people of Nabta Playa watched the stars from a desert that was slowly dying around them, and then they vanished into the landscape without leaving a name. They built with precision and departed in silence, and the world they left behind had no language for what they had been. It is a pattern that keeps returning in this exploration. Civilizations of remarkable sophistication, rising in places history barely glances at, and then dissolving so completely that their very existence had to be rediscovered by accident, by a shovel striking something unexpected in ground that was supposed to hold nothing of significance. The Oxus civilization was rediscovered almost exactly that way. The region known in antiquity as Bactria and Margiana spreads across what is now southern Turkmenistan, northern Afghanistan, and northeastern Iran, a vast, arid stretch of Central Asia that most historical narratives treat as a corridor, a space through which other civilizations passed on their way to somewhere more important. The Silk Road would eventually thread through here. Alexander the Great marched through here. Empires brushed against it on their way to other empires. But as a place of origination, as a source of civilization in its own right, it barely registered in mainstream historical consciousness until the second half of the 20th century. Then Soviet archaeologists, working systematically across the region during the 1970s, began uncovering something that did not fit the accepted map of the ancient world. Monumental mud brick architecture, planned settlements of considerable scale, temples, or structures that functioned as temples, built to designs that recurred consistently across multiple sites, suggesting a shared architectural and religious tradition spread across a wide geographic area. sophisticated metalwork in bronze, silver, and gold. Distinctive carved objects, cylinder seals, compartmented metal vessels, figurines of a particular style that began appearing in museum collections and antiquities markets, traced back to looted sites in Afghanistan, hinting at a material culture of genuine complexity. What Soviet archaeologist Viktor Saryanidi and his colleagues were uncovering was a Bronze Age civilization that had flourished across this region from approximately 2300 to 1700 BC, contemporary with the later Indus Valley cities, with Middle Kingdom Egypt, with the height of Minoan Crete. A civilization that had been entirely absent from the historical record and had left no name by which it called itself. Scholars named it the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, clinical, descriptive, and telling in its neutrality. In popular literature, it is sometimes called the Oxus Civilization, after the great river, now known as the Amu Darya, that flows through the region. At its center, both physically and symbolically, were the sacred complexes. The most extensively excavated is Gonur Tepe, in the Murgab River delta of what is now Turkmenistan. Saryanidi spent decades here, and what he uncovered was extraordinary. A large, walled complex organized around what he interpreted as a ceremonial core, with structures he identified as temples and ritual spaces arranged with clear intentionality. Fire altars, vessels containing traces of organic residues that, upon chemical analysis, yielded something remarkable. Evidence of a prepared drink containing ephedra, cannabis, and poppy. A ritual beverage, apparently, consumed in ceremonies conducted within these sacred spaces. This finding connected directly to one of the oldest debates in the study of ancient religion. The sacred texts of early Iranian religion, the Avesta, and the ancient Indian texts of the Rigveda both contain references to a ritual drink called hauma in one tradition, soma in the other. This substance, described as sacred and consciousness-altering, has been the subject of scholarly speculation for centuries. No one had ever found physical evidence of what it actually was. The residues at Gonur Tepe suggested, to Saryanidi and to others who found his analysis persuasive, that the Oxus civilization may have been the source, or at least a source, of the Hauma and Soma tradition that would flow into both Iranian and Indian religious culture. The implications are significant. If the Oxus sacred centers were the origin point, or a major transmission point, for ritual practices that shaped the religious traditions of half of Asia, then this forgotten civilization was not peripheral to history. It was, in some profound sense, central to it. But the claim remains contested. Other researchers have questioned the interpretation of the residues, the identification of the architectural spaces as temples, and the direct lineage from Oxus ritual practice to Vedic and Avestan religion. The connections are suggestive, they argue, but not proven. The Oxus civilization left no deciphered writing. Some inscribed objects have been found, but no script has been identified and translated, which means the sacred centers cannot speak for themselves. We are reading the architecture and the chemistry and drawing conclusions that the civilization itself cannot confirm or deny. Around 1700 BC, the Oxus sacred centers were abandoned. The great complex at Gonur Tepe was vacated. Other sites across the region followed. The civilization did not collapse in a single dramatic event. It appears to have dissolved gradually, its population dispersing southward and eastward into regions that would become part of later Iranian and South Asian cultural zones. Why? The favored explanation involves the Murgab River, the waterway that sustained agriculture in an otherwise arid landscape. Evidence suggests the river began shifting course, its distributaries moving and drying, removing the agricultural foundation on which the civilization depended. Without reliable water, the cities could not be maintained. The people followed the moisture, as people in this part of the world have always done. But the sacred centers were not simply abandoned in haste. At Gonur Tepe, there is evidence of deliberate closure, objects placed with care, spaces sealed in ways that suggest ritual intention rather than panicked flight. The people who left appear to have left on their own terms, performing whatever ceremonies marked the closing of a sacred place, and then walking away. They took their rituals with them. They may have taken their soma, and the mud brick walls they left behind slowly melted back into the desert until a Soviet archaeologist's shovel found them again, 4,000 years later. What was being worshipped in those fire-lit rooms? What was being drunk from those vessels in ceremonies conducted under the Central Asian stars? And how much of what those priests carried with them, dispersing southward into the ancient world, is still present, transformed beyond recognition, in the living religious traditions of today? The sacred centers are silent, but their echoes, perhaps, are still sounding. The priests of the Oxus civilization walked away from their sacred centers deliberately, carrying their rituals southward into a world that would absorb and transform what they knew into traditions still practiced today. They left their fire altars cold and their walls to dissolve back into the earth. It is a particular kind of disappearance, intentional, ceremonial, almost dignified. A closing of doors rather than a shattering of them. But some priestly traditions do not walk away. Some simply stop appearing in the record, present in one century, absent in the next, with nothing in between to explain the transition. Bahrain sits in the shallow waters of the Arabian Gulf, a small archipelago of islands so flat that from the air they appear to barely clear the surface of the sea. Today it is a modern state, connected to Saudi Arabia by a causeway, its skyline marked by glass towers and the infrastructure of a prosperous Gulf nation. But beneath the surface of this small island, literally beneath it, in the soil that construction projects and deliberate excavation have opened across decades, lies one of the ancient world's most persistent and least understood sacred landscapes. The mound fields of Bahrain are among the most remarkable funerary monuments in existence. An estimated 100,000 to 170,000 burial mounds once covered the northern and western portions of the island, a density of graves that, on an island of Bahrain's size, implies either an extraordinarily large local population burying their dead over a very long period, or something stranger. A sacred burial ground that drew the dead, and presumably the living who brought them, from a much wider region. Some researchers have proposed that ancient Bahrain functioned as a sacred necropolis, a destination for burial rather than simply a place where people happened to die. People came here, or were brought here, to be interred in sacred ground. This was Dilmun. In the cuneiform tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, Dilmun appears as something between a place and an idea. The Sumerians described it as a land of purity, a paradise where the sun rises, where there is no sickness and no death, where fresh water springs from the earth in miraculous abundance. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the immortal flood survivor Utnapishtim is placed in Dilmun after his ordeal, a figure analogous in many respects to later traditions of paradise and eternal life. Dilmun was sacred in the Mesopotamian imagination in a way that transcended ordinary geography. It was a real place. Traders went there, goods moved through it, administrative tablets record commercial transactions involving Dilmun merchants. But it carried a religious weight that ordinary trading ports do not. Archaeological excavation has confirmed Bahrain as the most likely physical location of Dilmun, with significant activity beginning around 3000 BC and extending through the second millennium BC. Danish archaeologists working on the island from the 1950s onward uncovered temples, settlements, and the burial mounds in quantities that steadily reshaped the understanding of what this small island had once been. At Qalat al-Bahrain, a layered site occupied across thousands of years, excavations revealed a settlement of continuous habitation stretching from the early Bronze Age through the Islamic period, a palimpsest of human presence in which each era built upon the remnants of the one before. At the center of Dilmun's religious landscape stood a temple dedicated to Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, fresh water, and magic. This association was not incidental. Bahrain sits above an extraordinary natural phenomenon: freshwater springs that bubble up through the seabed in the surrounding Gulf, and freshwater lenses that lie beneath the island itself, reachable by wells even in a landscape surrounded by salt water. In a region defined by aridity and the scarcity of fresh water, Bahrain was anomalous. An island where sweet water emerged from the earth and from the sea floor as if by divine arrangement. To the ancient Mesopotamian mind, this was precisely the kind of place where Enki would reside, where the boundary between the sacred fresh waters of the deep and the human world was thinnest. And so, a priesthood served here. Temples were built, maintained, and rebuilt across centuries. Rituals were conducted. The burial mounds accumulated. Then, somewhere in the middle of the second millennium BC, the institutional religious life of Dilmun appears to falter. The temples show evidence of declining maintenance. The burial mound construction, which had continued for over 1,000 years, slows and eventually stops. By the time outside powers, first the Kassites of Babylonia, then the Assyrians, then others, extend their administrative reach into the Gulf region, Dilmun, as a functioning sacred center, appears diminished, absorbed into larger political and commercial structures that treat it as a port of economic value rather than a site of religious significance. The priesthood, whatever its organization and tradition, has ceased to leave a visible trace. What happened to it is not recorded. The tablets that mention Dilmun are Mesopotamian documents, commercial records, literary texts, administrative notations made by outsiders looking toward the island from the northern edge of the Gulf. They tell us what Dilmun meant to the Sumerians and Babylonians. They do not tell us what Dilmun meant to the people who lived on it, who maintained its temples, who oversaw the burial of the dead that came from across the Gulf to rest in its sacred soil. Those people kept no archive that has yet been found. Their ritual texts, if they existed, have not survived or not been located. The internal religious life of Dilmun, the theology of its priests, the ceremonies conducted over the freshwater springs, the beliefs that sustained a burial tradition on a scale without parallel in the ancient Gulf, remains almost entirely unknown. Some researchers have speculated that the religious traditions of Dilmun fed into later Arabian and Semitic spiritual frameworks, that the sacred geography of the island persisted in transformed cultural memory long after the institutional priesthood dissolved. The freshwater springs, after all, did not disappear. The island did not lose the quality that made it sacred. Only the people who tended that sacredness seem to have gone. The burial mounds are still there, tens of thousands of them, eroded and reduced by time and development, but present, covering the island like a long, slow exhalation of the ancient world. Beneath them lie the dead who were brought here to rest in sacred ground, tended by priests whose names we do not know, performing rites we cannot reconstruct, in service of a theology that the island kept entirely to itself. What did they know about this place that made it worth crossing the Gulf to be buried here? And what did they say, at the edge of those freshwater springs, in ceremonies that the sea has since swallowed whole? The priests of Dilmun tended their sacred springs and oversaw the burial of the dead brought from across the Gulf, and then simply ceased to appear in the record, leaving behind tens of thousands of mounds and no explanation. Their silence is the silence of an institution that closed without announcement, a tradition that ended without a final entry. We are left with the physical consequences of their work and none of the reasoning behind it. It is a reminder that the ancient world was vast in ways our maps still fail to capture, that while Egypt was building its Middle Kingdom and Mesopotamia was managing its empires, there were sophisticated, organized societies operating in places that conventional history has long treated as empty space. The southern Ural steppe is one of those places. It stretches across what is now the Chelyabinsk Oblast of Russia, a wide open grassland region east of the Ural Mountains, where the landscape flattens into a horizon so unbroken that the sky seems larger than it does anywhere else. Cold in winter with a severity that defines everything. Briefly warm in summer, crossed by rivers that move slowly through the plain. To the modern eye, it is remote. To the ancient world, it was something else. A corridor, a crossroads, a zone where the pastoral cultures of the Eurasian steppe met, traded, competed, and occasionally built something that outlasted them. In 1987, Soviet archaeologists conducting a survey ahead of the construction of a reservoir made a discovery that halted the project entirely. From aerial photographs, the outlines of a circular structure were visible in the earth. Concentric rings of what appeared to be walls, precisely arranged, covering an area of roughly 20,000 square meters. On the ground, excavation confirmed what the photographs suggested. This was a planned settlement of deliberate and sophisticated design, constructed sometime around 2000 to 1800 BC by a people belonging to what archaeologists now call the Sintashta culture. The site was named Archaeum. Its layout was striking. Two concentric circular walls, built from mud brick and timber, enclosed an interior space organized into residential and communal structures arranged in a ring. A central square. A drainage system built into the foundations. Streets that ran in arcs following the circular plan. The whole complex oriented, researchers noted, with reference to astronomical phenomena, solstice alignments, lunar standstill positions, configurations suggesting that whoever designed Archaeum understood the sky well enough to embed its rhythms into the geometry of their city. This was not a casual settlement. It was a designed environment, built with intention and maintained with discipline, in the middle of a steppe that history had assumed was home to nothing more organized than nomadic herding communities. The Sintashta culture, which Archaeum represents, has since been recognized as one of the most significant Bronze Age societies in Eurasia. It is associated with some of the earliest evidence of spoke-wheeled chariots, a military and transportation technology that would spread across the ancient world with transformative consequences. Sintashta metallurgy was advanced, producing bronze weapons and tools that circulated across wide networks. The culture's burial practices were elaborate, with horses and chariots interred alongside high-status individuals in a manner that echoes, in striking ways, the burial traditions described in early Indo-Iranian religious texts. The connection to Indo-Iranian tradition is not incidental. Many scholars now place the Sintashta culture within or near the origin point of the Proto-Indo-Iranian language, the ancestral tongue that would diverge into the Vedic Sanskrit of early India and the Avestan of early Iran. The people of Archaeum may have been, in a very real sense, among the ancestors of half of Asia's linguistic and religious heritage. The same heritage, possibly, that the Oxus priests carried southward when they closed their sacred centers a few centuries later. But it is what lies beneath Archaeum that draws a particular, quieter kind of attention. During excavation, archaeologists identified structures below the main floor levels of the settlement, spaces that were not simply foundations or storage pits, but appeared to be purposefully constructed underground chambers integrated into the design of the buildings above them. Some were associated with metallurgical activity, the smelting of bronze, conducted in spaces where the underground design may have created natural ventilation systems, drawing air through channels in ways that maintained the temperatures required for metalworking. This was sophisticated engineering, built below ground level with a functional precision that implied considerable accumulated knowledge. But not all of the subterranean spaces have yielded straightforward functional explanations. Some appear to have served purposes that the excavated evidence does not make immediately clear. Spaces too small for habitation, too deliberately constructed for casual storage, positioned in ways that suggest intentional relationship to the structures above, and possibly to astronomical alignments that govern the site's overall design. Russian archaeologist Gennady Zdanovich, who led excavations at Archaeum for decades, described the site as a unified cosmological environment, a place where the physical layout of the city, the orientation of its spaces, and the underground chambers beneath it formed a single integrated system reflecting the worldview of the people who built it. On this reading, Archaeum was not simply a town with some interesting engineering. It was a built cosmology, a three-dimensional expression of how its inhabitants understood the relationship between earth, sky, and whatever lay beneath both. The more speculative literature surrounding Archaeum has gone considerably further. Russian nationalist and esoteric writers, beginning in the 1990s, attached enormous cultural and metaphysical significance to the site, proposing it as the origin of Aryan civilization, a sacred center of world historical importance, a kind of northern paradise referenced in ancient texts. These claims have not found support in mainstream archaeology, which treats them with considerable skepticism and some concern about the ideological frameworks they serve. But they persist, as fringe theories always do around sites that legitimate scholarship has not yet fully explained. And Archaeum is not yet fully explained. The underground chambers have not all been excavated. The astronomical alignments have not reached full consensus. The relationship between the Sintashta culture and the religious traditions it may have seeded across Asia remains a matter of active research and genuine uncertainty. Archaeum was abandoned around 1600 BC, deliberately it appears, and by fire. The settlement was burned, possibly by its own inhabitants, in what some researchers interpret as a ritual closure, a ceremonial ending of a sacred space, consistent with practices seen at other Bronze Age sites across the region. They built it with extraordinary care. They oriented it to the sky. They constructed chambers beneath it whose purposes we have not fully determined. And then they burned it down and walked away. What were those underground spaces for? What was conducted in them, beneath the streets of a city already oriented to the heavens above? The steppe holds the answer, quietly, beneath a layer of ash that is now 4,000 years old. The people of Archaeum burned their city and walked away. A deliberate ending, a ritual closure performed with fire and intention. They left the steppe to reclaim what they had built, and the ash they left behind has held its secrets across 4,000 years of silence. It is a pattern we keep encountering in this exploration. Civilizations that ended not with conquest or catastrophe, but with something that looks almost like choice. A decision to close, to seal, to disappear on their own terms. But if Archaeum's people chose their ending, what do we make of a civilization that fought for survival across 3,000 years? That rose and fell and rose again, that traded with Mesopotamia, warred with Assyria, and produced art of haunting sophistication, and yet managed, somehow, to conceal the resting places of its kings so completely that not a single royal tomb has ever been found. The Zagros Mountains rise in long, folded ridges across what is now southwestern Iran. A landscape of dramatic contrasts, where limestone peaks give way to fertile river valleys, and the light falls differently depending on the hour, shifting the color of the rock from pale gold to deep amber as the day moves. It is ancient country in the most literal sense. People have lived in these valleys for tens of thousands of years. Cities grew here when most of the world was still organized around small agricultural villages. This was Elam. The Elamite civilization is one of the oldest in the world, with roots extending back to at least 3200 BC, contemporary with the earliest phases of Mesopotamian civilization, and in some respects developing in parallel with it, sharing technologies and trading relationships while maintaining a cultural identity that was distinctly, stubbornly, its own. The Elamite language belongs to no known language family. It stands alone, an isolate, unrelated to Sumerian, unrelated to the Semitic languages of its neighbors, unrelated to anything that has been identified elsewhere. For over 3,000 years, Elam used this language to administer a kingdom, conduct diplomacy, record religious texts, and inscribe the achievements of its rulers on monuments that still, in some cases, stand. Susa was its great city, a site occupied almost continuously from around 4200 BC onward, layered with the accumulated material of civilization upon civilization, excavated by French archaeologists beginning in the late 19th century in campaigns that lasted, with interruptions, for the better part of 100 years. From Susa came extraordinary objects. The great law stele of Hammurabi, brought there as war trophy by an Elamite king who carried it from Babylon. The victory stele of Naram-Sin. Objects looted from Mesopotamia across centuries of conflict, assembled in Susa as monuments to Elamite power. Elam was not a peripheral culture absorbing the achievements of greater neighbors. At its height, during the Middle Elamite period of roughly 1500 to 1100 BC, it was a major power, capable of sacking Babylon, of projecting military force across the entire Near East, of producing bronze castings and glazed architectural decoration of extraordinary quality. The ziggurat at Chogazanbil, constructed around 1250 BC by the Elamite king Untashnapirisha, remains one of the best preserved ziggurats in existence. A massive step tower rising from the plain, built not in the heart of an existing city but in a new sacred complex constructed specifically as a religious center, a place where Elamite gods could be approached with appropriate ceremony. And yet, for all of this, for all the centuries of documented history, the monuments, the inscriptions, the objects that have emerged from Susa and from sites across the Zagros region, not one royal tomb of an Elamite king has been identified and excavated. In Mesopotamia, royal tombs exist. The royal cemetery at Ur produced burial assemblages of almost incomprehensible richness. Gold helmets, lapis lazuli jewelry, lyres, and the disturbing evidence of human sacrifice conducted at the moment of royal interment. In Egypt, the tombs of pharaohs have been sought, found, and studied for 2 centuries. Even in regions far less archaeologically explored than Elam, royal burials have surfaced. The graves of the powerful tend to leave traces. Elamite royal graves have left none that archaeology has yet confirmed. This absence is not for lack of looking. Susa has been excavated extensively. Other major Elamite sites have been surveyed and dug. Texts refer to royal burials. There are Elamite and Mesopotamian references that confirm Elamite kings were interred with ceremony and with grave goods of significance. The burials happened. They simply have not been found. The most straightforward explanation is geographical. The Zagros Mountains offer an enormous and largely unexplored landscape of valleys, caves, and terrain that has never been subjected to systematic archaeological survey. The political conditions of the region, in Iran, where access for international archaeological teams has been restricted across long periods of the modern era, have limited the scope of investigation considerably. The tombs may exist unlocated in terrain that archaeology has not yet reached. Others have proposed that Elamite royal burial practices may have deliberately avoided the kind of monumental construction that leaves visible archaeological signatures. Some ancient cultures interred their kings in locations chosen precisely for their inconspicuousness. Natural features, unmarked ground, places that would not invite the attention of tomb robbers or conquering armies. If Elamite kings were buried this way, the absence of discovered tombs reflects intention rather than accident. There is also the question of what repeated conquest did to the burial landscape. Elam was sacked multiple times, most devastatingly by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal around 646 BC, in a campaign so thorough that Assyrian records describe the deliberate desecration of Elamite royal tombs, the removal of bones, the disruption of burial places intended to dishonor the Elamite dead across eternity. If Ashurbanipal's forces reach the royal tombs, what they left behind may be unrecognizable as what it once was. But Ashurbanipal's account is itself incomplete. He describes desecrating tombs he found, the tombs he did not find, the burials that remained hidden from his soldiers as they had remained hidden from everyone else. Those he does not mention, because he did not reach them. Somewhere in the folds of the Zagros Mountains, in terrain that has been inhabited for 10,000 years and systematically studied for almost none of it, the kings of Elam may still be resting exactly where their priests place them, undisturbed, unlocated, surrounded by whatever it was that an Elamite king required for whatever came after. 3,000 years of civilization, a language that stands entirely alone, a religious tradition of genuine complexity, and not one grave that we have found. What were the Elamites protecting in the way they hid their dead? And what might still be waiting in the mountain valleys for the moment archaeology finally looks in the right place? The Elamite kings hid their dead so well that 3,000 years of archaeology has not found them. A civilization that endured longer than most, that left inscriptions and monuments and a language unlike any other on Earth, and yet managed to conceal the one thing that royal cultures almost always announce: the resting place of their rulers. Whatever they were protecting in those hidden graves, they protected it absolutely. There is something in that concealment that resonates across this entire exploration. The pattern is not always violent erasure or sudden catastrophe. Sometimes what disappears does so quietly, deliberately, as if the people involved understood that what they carried was too significant, or too fragile, or too dangerous to leave exposed to the ordinary passage of history. The fire temples of Bactria Margiana disappeared that way. The landscape of the Murghab River Delta in what is now southern Turkmenistan is flat and dry in a way that feels almost absolute, a terrain so thoroughly emptied by aridity that the occasional low mound rising from the plain draws the eye with disproportionate force. These mounds are the compressed remains of mud brick architecture, slowly dissolved back into the earth over millennia, their interiors preserving under the right conditions the charred remnants of wooden beams, ceramic vessels, and ritual objects that once made them centers of organized religious life. We have already encountered Gonur Tepe in this exploration, the great central complex of the Oxus civilization, where Sarianidi identified fire altars and ritual vessels carrying residues of the Hauma drink. But Gonur Tepe was not alone. Across the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, a network of sites has yielded architectural evidence of fire worship conducted with striking consistency. Temples oriented in similar ways, fire altars constructed to similar specifications, ritual deposits following patterns that recur across sites separated by considerable distances. This consistency matters. It implies not isolated local practice, but a shared religious tradition maintained across a wide geographic area by people who understood themselves as participants in a common spiritual framework. A tradition, in other words, with institutional depth. Priests who trained other priests, rituals transmitted with enough fidelity to reproduce similar physical environments at site after site across a region the size of a small country. The fire temples of Bactria Margiana represent, on current archaeological evidence, some of the earliest physical manifestations of fire worship in the ancient world. And fire worship, of course, is the defining practice of Zoroastrianism, the religion attributed to the prophet Zarathustra, which would become the state religion of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and whose cosmological framework would exert influence on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in ways that scholars are still tracing. The question of whether the Bactria Margiana fire temples were Proto-Zoroastrian, directly Zoroastrian, or something related but distinct is one of the most actively debated in the study of ancient religion. Sarianidi argued directly for a Zoroastrian identification, proposing that the ritual complex at Gonur Tepe represented early Zoroastrian practice, and that the Oxus civilization was the cultural matrix from which Zarathustra's religion emerged. Other scholars have pushed back, noting that the dating creates difficulties. The Bactria Margiana complex flourished several centuries before the period most commonly proposed for Zarathustra's life, and that the ritual residues and architectural forms, while suggestive, cannot be straightforwardly mapped onto the theology of the Avesta. But the debate itself is telling. The fact that it is even plausible to argue for this connection, that the physical evidence at these Central Asian sites is consistent enough with later Zoroastrian practice to sustain serious scholarly discussion, indicates that something was happening here that mattered enormously to the subsequent religious history of a wide world. Around 1700 BC, the fire temples went dark. The abandonment of the Bactria Margiana sacred centers followed the drying of the Murghab River's distributaries, the same environmental transformation that emptied the residential settlements and dispersed the population southward and eastward. But the manner in which the temples were closed carries its own significance. At multiple sites, archaeologists have found evidence of deliberate ritual decommissioning, sacred objects placed with care in final positions, spaces sealed in ways that suggest ceremony rather than abandonment. The fires on the altars were not simply left to go out. They appear to have been extinguished with intention, as part of a process that acknowledged the ending of what had been conducted in these spaces. This is, in the archaeology of religion, a meaningful distinction. A temple abandoned in panic or destroyed by force looks different from a temple closed by its own priests. Bactria Margiana's sacred centers, on current evidence, were closed by the people who served them. Where did those priests go? The southward dispersal of the Oxus population into the regions that would become Iran and the northwestern Indian subcontinent provides a geographical answer, but not a religious one. What happened to the fire tradition in the centuries between the closure of the Bactrian temples and the emergence of documented Zoroastrian practice in the Achaemenid period is a gap that the archaeological record has not yet filled. The tradition did not simply vanish. Fire worship in Iran is a continuous, documented presence across the subsequent millennia. But the institutional thread connecting the Bactrian altars to the later temples of Persia is broken, or at least invisible, in the current state of evidence. Some researchers have proposed that the tradition survived in oral and ritual form, carried by priestly lineages that maintained it without fixed sacred architecture during the centuries of migration and resettlement. A portable religion, transmitted from teacher to student across generations, waiting for the political and geographical conditions under which it could build permanent temples again. This is historically plausible. Many religious traditions have survived precisely this way, through human memory and transmitted practice, rather than institutional infrastructure. The Vedic tradition of India, which shares so much with early Iranian religion, was preserved orally for centuries before it was committed to writing. There is no reason the fire tradition of Bactria Margiana could not have traveled the same way. But the gap remains a gap. The altars went cold. The priests departed. And what passed between the last ceremony at Gunur Tepe and the first documented fire temple of the Persian Empire is a silence of several centuries that no one has yet filled with certainty. Somewhere in that silence, a tradition transformed into a world religion. What was carried out of those temples, in the minds and memories of the priests who closed them, and how much of what they knew about fire, about cosmic order, about the sacred obligations of the living toward forces larger than themselves, is still present, however transformed, in the religious life of millions of people today. The altars are cold. The tradition, in some form, is not. The fire priests of Bactria Margiana carried something out of their closing temples and walked southward into history. A tradition preserved in human memory across centuries of silence, eventually resurfacing as one of the world's great religions. What they transmitted was invisible, interior, carried in the minds of those who received it. No walls, no altars, no fixed address. But not everything ancient and mysterious is invisible. Some things are so large that you cannot see them at all, until you are high enough above the earth to take in their full dimensions. From ground level, they are nothing. A low stone wall, perhaps knee-high, running across a rocky desert plateau for no apparent reason, in no apparent direction. Another wall, parallel to it, or angled slightly toward it. And then another. Walking among them, you would register them as geological curiosity at most, the kind of feature that the eye notes and the mind does not pursue. But from the air, everything changes. Across the desert landscapes of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Yemen, and the broader Arabian Peninsula, and extending into the Negev, the Sinai, and beyond, there are tens of thousands of stone structures visible only from altitude. They appear in aerial photographs and satellite imagery as long, tapering shapes. Two walls converging toward a narrow enclosure, like the string and body of a kite. Some are simple, formed from just a few hundred meters of low stone wall. Others are enormous, their leading walls extending for several kilometers across the desert, their enclosures large enough to contain a city block. They are called desert kites, named for the shape they form when viewed from above. And they have been there, in some cases, for an extraordinarily long time. Dating desert kites is methodologically difficult. They are built from surface stone, with no mortar and no organic material that readily yields to radiocarbon analysis. But archaeological context. The artifacts found in association with certain kites, the relationship of the structures to datable layers in nearby sites, has allowed researchers to establish that some desert kites were constructed as early as 9,000 to 7,000 BC. That places them among the oldest large-scale human constructions on Earth. older than the pyramids by several thousand years, older than Stonehenge, roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of settled agricultural life in the ancient Near East, and they were built across an enormous geographic range. Current estimates, based on systematic satellite survey, place the number of identified kite structures across the Arabian region and surrounding areas at over 6,000. The full extent has almost certainly not yet been documented. The mainstream explanation for desert kites is functional. They were hunting traps. The converging walls would guide herds of migrating animals, gazelle, ibex, wild ass, toward the narrow enclosure at the apex, where hunters waiting inside the enclosure could slaughter them efficiently and in large numbers. This explanation is supported by several lines of evidence. The orientation of many kites corresponds to known animal migration routes. Bone assemblages at certain sites include the remains of large numbers of gazelle, consistent with mass hunting events. Ethnographic accounts from relatively recent periods describe similar driving techniques used by hunters in the region. The hunting trap interpretation is, in broad terms, persuasive. It fits the physical evidence. It fits the known behavior of the animals that inhabited these landscapes. It fits what we understand about the subsistence strategies of prehistoric communities in the region. But it does not fit everything. Some desert kites are oriented in ways that do not align with known animal migration paths. Some are positioned in terrain that would have been poorly suited to the kind of coordinated animal drive the hunting trap hypothesis requires. Some are constructed with an elaborateness, additional chambers, multiple enclosures, complex arrangements of subsidiary walls, that seems excessive for a purely utilitarian hunting structure. And some kites have been found in clusters so dense that the landscape would have been saturated with trap structures, raising questions about whether the hunting pressure implied by such a network would have been sustainable for the animal populations of any given region. Researchers working on desert kites in Jordan and Saudi Arabia have also noted that certain kite configurations correspond, in their geometric properties, to patterns that appear in other ancient contexts with symbolic or cosmological significance. Spiral forms, radial arrangements, structures that seem to encode spatial relationships not obviously required by the functional hunting interpretation. This observation is preliminary and contested. It is far easier to see patterns in ancient structures than to determine what those patterns meant to the people who built them, or whether they were intentional at all. More recently, large-scale satellite survey projects have documented kite structures in Yemen and in parts of the Arabian interior that were previously unknown to archaeology, some in configurations that differ enough from the classic kite form to suggest either regional variation in purpose or entirely distinct traditions of construction that the same aerial silhouette happens to resemble. The sheer scale of the phenomenon is itself a question. 6,000 structures distributed across millions of square kilometers of desert, built over a period that may span several thousand years. Even if every single one of them was a hunting trap, the organizational effort implied by their construction, the coordination of labor across generations, the transmission of the building knowledge required to replicate a consistent form across enormous distances and long time spans, implies a social and cultural infrastructure that the historical record of the region does not yet fully explain. Who organized the building of these structures across such vast distances? How was the knowledge of their construction transmitted, generation to generation, across landscapes where permanent settlement was sparse and contact between communities irregular? And why, at some point, did the building stop? The kites are still there, written across the desert in stone lines that the casual traveler will never notice, and the satellite camera cannot stop finding. From the ground, they are nothing. From the sky, they cover the earth. What were they, really? And who looked down to appreciate the full shape of what they had made? The desert kites stretch across Arabia in their thousands, visible only from above, built over time spans so long and across distances so vast that the organizational logic behind them remains just beyond our grasp. They are structures of the land, stone laid on stone, fixed, permanent, waiting. Whatever purpose drove their construction, it was pursued with extraordinary patience and across an extraordinary geography. But not all ancient mysteries are written in stone. Some were written on water. And water, unlike stone, keeps nothing. The Persian Gulf today is one of the most commercially active bodies of water on Earth. Tankers moving in slow procession across a surface that shimmers with heat, cargo vessels threading between offshore platforms, the horizon broken by the silhouettes of industry and transit. It is a waterway defined, in the modern imagination, almost entirely by oil. But strip away the last century, strip away the last several centuries, and what remains is something far older and in many ways more interesting, a maritime corridor that was, 4,000 years ago, the center of a trading network so sophisticated and so extensive that its collapse sent ripples across the entire ancient Near East. And we have almost nothing left of the ships that sailed it. The Bronze Age trade network of the Persian Gulf connected three of the ancient world's great civilizations in a system of commercial exchange that operated, by all evidence, with remarkable regularity and volume. Mesopotamia, the cities of Lagash, Nippur, centered in what is now Iraq, supplied textiles and grain. The Indus Valley civilization, operating from ports along what is now the Pakistani and Indian coastline, sent carnelian beads, ivory, and luxury goods of extraordinary craftsmanship westward. And between them, serving as intermediary and entrepot, was Dilmun, the sacred island of Bahrain that we have already encountered in this exploration, along with a trading station called Magan, identified by most researchers with the region of modern Oman and the UAE, and a third point called Meluha, the Mesopotamian name for the Indus ports. The Mesopotamian administrative records document this trade in considerable detail. Clay tablets from the city of dating to roughly 2000 to 1800 BC, list specific commodities, specific merchants, specific transactions involving ships arriving from Dilmun, loaded with copper, wood, and goods from further east. One archive, the records of a merchant named Ea Nasir, preserves not only transaction records, but complaint letters, including what some scholars have called the world's oldest recorded customer complaint, written by a merchant furious about the quality of copper delivered and the poor treatment he received. The trade was real, documented, and operating at scale. The ships that conducted this trade are almost entirely archaeologically invisible. This is not surprising, in one sense. Wooden vessels in a tropical maritime environment do not preserve well. The conditions of the Persian Gulf, warm water, wood-boring organisms, the destructive effects of salt and humidity, are hostile to the survival of organic material across thousands of years. We should not expect to find Bronze Age ships on the Gulf floor in the condition that, say, cold northern European waters have occasionally preserved ancient vessels. But the complete absence of physical evidence is still striking. No confirmed Bronze Age shipwreck has been identified in the Persian Gulf. No harbor installation from the period has been excavated that preserves the physical infrastructure of the trade in meaningful detail. The anchors, the loading facilities, the warehouses that must have lined the shores of Dilmun and Magan, these have left traces so faint that reconstructing the physical reality of the trade from archaeology alone would be nearly impossible without the textual record. What the textual record preserves is tantalizing, but incomplete. The Mesopotamian tablets tell us what was traded and approximately what it cost. They tell us that the journey between and Dilmun took a specific number of days under favorable conditions. They mention the names of merchants and occasionally the names of their vessels, but they do not describe the ships in technical detail. They do not tell us how far offshore the routes ran, what navigational methods were used, what happened when the weather turned. Some of those answers have been pursued through experimental archaeology. Scholars and adventurers have reconstructed ancient Gulf vessels based on the limited iconographic and textual evidence available. Reed boats of the kind depicted in Mesopotamian art, stitched plank wooden vessels of the type referenced in later Gulf seafaring traditions, and sailed them along routes that the ancient merchants might have followed. These experiments have demonstrated that the journey was feasible with ancient technology, that the Gulf's wind and current patterns were compatible with regular seasonal trading voyages, and that the organizational demands of maintaining a sustained trading network across these distances were significant, but not beyond the capacity of a well-organized Bronze Age society. But why did it stop? Around 1700 to 1600 BC, the textual references to the Gulf trading network thin and then disappear. The Indus Valley civilization was in terminal decline. The cities of Mesopotamia were passing through a period of political disruption. Dilmun continued to be inhabited, but its role as commercial intermediary seems to have diminished significantly. The three-point trading system that had connected the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations for several centuries simply ceased to function at the scale it had achieved. The conventional explanation is systemic collapse, the same broad disruption that ended the Indus cities, destabilized Mesopotamian political structures, and emptied the Oxus sacred centers, all falling within roughly the same period, for a combination of climatic, political, and economic reasons that reinforced each other in a cascade that no single intervention could have reversed. This explanation is almost certainly broadly correct, and yet it raises its own unanswered question. The merchants who sailed these routes, the men who knew the Gulf's seasonal winds, the pilots who navigated between Ur and Dilmun and Magan and Maluha across decades of regular voyaging, the shipbuilders who understood how to construct vessels capable of carrying copper ore across open water. What happened to their knowledge when the trade stopped? Navigation is not recorded in administrative tablets. Shipbuilding techniques are not preserved in complaint letters. The practical embodied knowledge of how to sail the Bronze Age Gulf existed in the minds and hands of the people who did it. When they stopped doing it, that knowledge went with them. And somewhere beneath the warm, still water of the Persian Gulf, in conditions that preserve almost nothing, the last ships of the Bronze Age trading network settled into the sediment. We have the receipts. We have the complaints. We have the names of the merchants. We do not have a single plank of the ships they sailed. The Bronze Age trading network of the Persian Gulf collapsed and took its navigational knowledge with it, swallowed by a convergence of disruptions that no single cause fully explains, leaving behind only administrative tablets and the silence of a sea that keeps no wooden record. The ships are gone. The routes are gone. The men who knew the winds are gone. But the cities those ships served, some of them endured. Diminished, transformed, absorbed into new political frameworks and new cultural identities, but physically present, continuously inhabited. Layered over millennia, with the accumulated material of civilization pressing down upon civilization, each era sealing the one before it beneath new floors, new walls, new constructions built from the rubble of what came before. Susa is one of those cities. And what lies beneath its surface is a record of destruction so deep and so repeated that the archaeology of the site reads less like a history of settlement and more like a history of fire. The Tell of Susa rises from the flat plain of Khuzestan in southwestern Iran, a low, broad mound that has been occupied, with only brief interruptions, for approximately 6,000 years. It is one of the longest continuously inhabited sites in the world. French archaeological missions worked here from the 1880s onward, cutting through its layers in campaigns that lasted across various phases, nearly a century. What they found as they dug downward was not a stable, gradual accumulation of ordinary urban life. It was a sequence of destruction events, burned layers, collapsed structures, ash deposits, interspersed with periods of rebuilding and renewed occupation, in a cycle that repeated itself across millennia with a regularity that feels almost rhythmic. At the deepest excavated levels, beneath the Elamite city we have already encountered in this exploration, beneath the layers associated with Achaemenid Persia and the periods that followed, there are temple structures of extraordinary antiquity. The earliest religious buildings at Susa date to around 4000 BC, mud brick platforms and enclosed spaces that archaeologists have identified as ceremonial or cultic in function, built during a period when Susa was part of a broader cultural horizon sometimes called the Uruk expansion, when the city of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia was projecting its administrative and commercial influence across a wide region of the ancient Near East. These earliest temples were burned. The burning is not ambiguous. The archaeological layers are clear: a period of construction and use, followed by a destruction event involving fire, intense enough to leave a distinct and datable stratum, followed by rebuilding that in some cases reproduced the previous structure's plan, and in others departed from it significantly. This cycle, build, burn, rebuild, appears multiple times in Susa's deep stratigraphy, in contexts spanning from its prehistoric religious foundations through its Elamite and post-Elamite phases. The question that the burning layers raise is one that archaeology alone cannot definitively answer. Which fires were set by enemies? Which by accident? And which, if any, were set deliberately by the people who used the temples themselves? The distinction matters enormously. A temple burned by conquest is a record of violence, of power transferred by force, of one cultural order imposing itself on another. A temple burned by its own priests is something different, a ritual act, a deliberate ending, perhaps a purification or a closure of the kind we have seen at Archaeum and at the Bactrian sacred centers. The physical evidence of the burning is identical in both cases. The meaning is not. For the earliest destruction events at Susa, the evidence leans cautiously toward external agency. The late 4th millennium BC was a period of significant political disruption across the ancient Near East, as the Uruk network that had projected Mesopotamian commercial and administrative influence across the region contracted sharply around 3100 BC. Sites that had been part of the Uruk sphere were abandoned, reorganized, or in some cases, violently disrupted. Susa, positioned at the edge of this network, may have experienced the contraction as something more sudden and destructive than a mere withdrawal of commercial ties. But the later burning events are harder to categorize. Susa passed through the hands of Elamite kings, Akkadian conquerors, Babylonian rulers, Kassite administrators, Assyrian invaders, and eventually Achaemenid Persian monarchs, each transition leaving its mark in the stratigraphy, some leaving it in fire. The Assyrian sack of Susa under Ashurbanipal around 646 BC was documented in the Assyrian records with a thoroughness that makes clear it was a deliberate act of destruction, intended not just to defeat Elam militarily, but to erase its sacred landscape. Ashurbanipal described carrying away the statues of Elamite gods, desecrating royal tombs, and salting the land, a rhetoric of total cultural annihilation that the archaeological record at Susa partially corroborates. Yet even the Assyrian destruction layer, thorough as it was, did not end Susa. The city was rebuilt, again. As it had been rebuilt after every previous destruction, with a persistence that suggests something about Susa's geographical and symbolic position that made abandonment unthinkable, regardless of what had been done to it. What were those earliest temples for? The structures at the base of Susa's stratigraphy predate the Elamite kingdom, predate the written records that allow us to name the gods worshipped there, predate the cultural frameworks within which Susa's later religious life can be at least partially understood. They belong to a period of Susa's history that is almost entirely archaeological, known through objects and layers and architectural remains, rather than through any text that explains what the people who used them believed or what they were doing inside them. The burned temples at the bottom of Susa's sequence are, in this sense, among the most ancient religious mysteries in the world. We know they were built. We know they were used. We know they were burned. We know that people came back and built again in the same place, as if the location itself demanded continuity, regardless of what had been destroyed. Why here? What made this particular piece of the Khuzestan plain sacred enough that people returned to it century after century, millennium after millennium, through conquest and fire and the collapse of entire civilizations? The plain is flat and wide and gives no obvious answer. But beneath the surface, the burned layers are still there, each one a question that the next layer of construction chose not to answer, pressing it down instead into the permanent, silent record of the earth. Susa returned to itself after every destruction, rebuilt on the same ground, through fire and conquest and the collapse of empires, as if the place itself refused to be abandoned. There is something almost compulsive about that continuity, something that suggests the location held a significance that no amount of burning could extinguish. Sacred ground, in the ancient world, had a gravity that political disruption could interrupt, but rarely permanently dissolve. But Susa, for all its mystery, existed within a world we at least partially recognize. The ancient Near East, with its documented empires and decipherable languages and interconnected civilizations that have been studied for over a century. Its mysteries are the mysteries of incomplete evidence within a broadly understood framework. What happens when we step entirely outside that framework? When we encounter a civilization so geographically remote from everything we consider the cradle of complexity that its very existence forces a reconsideration of what we thought we understood about how and where human civilization first developed. In the Supe Valley of coastal Peru, roughly 200 kilometers north of Lima, the land moves between extremes with startling abruptness. The Pacific coast here is desert, one of the driest places on Earth, where decades can pass without meaningful rainfall, where the ground is pale and powdered, and the sun falls on it with an intensity that bleaches everything to the same uniform absence of color. And then, cutting through this desert, the Supe River, carrying water down from the Andes, creates a narrow corridor of fertility, a green thread through an otherwise lifeless landscape. It was here, in this unlikely place, that one of the oldest cities in the Western Hemisphere was built. Caral dates to approximately 2600 to 2000 BC, contemporary, remarkably, with the Old Kingdom of Egypt, with the height of the Indus Valley civilization, with the early phases of the Bronze Age cultures we have been tracing across the Old World throughout this exploration. It was not a village or a modest ceremonial site. It was a city, planned, organized, and built at a scale that implies a population of thousands and a social structure capable of coordinating large-scale labor across sustained periods of time. 6 large platform mounds dominated the urban center, the largest rising to a height of roughly 18 meters. Not the size of the great Egyptian pyramids, but monumental by any other standard, and built without metal tools, without the wheel, and without draft animals. Caral had sunken circular plazas, residential compounds, storage facilities, and an acoustic sophistication that researchers have noted with interest. The circular plazas appear to have been designed, in part, for the amplification and containment of sound, suggesting that music and communal auditory experience played a role in the city's ceremonial life. Researchers found evidence of musical instruments, flutes made from condor and pelican bones, cornets fashioned from deer and llama bones, in quantities that suggested musical performance was not incidental to Caral's culture, but central to it. And the city appears to have been remarkably peaceful, at least for most of its history. This is one of Caral's most debated characteristics. The site's principal excavator, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady, has argued that Caral represents evidence of a civilization that achieved urban complexity without warfare. No defensive walls, no weapons caches, no skeletal evidence of mass violence of the kind that appears in contemporaneous Old World urban contexts. The social order that built and maintained Caral on this reading was organized around religion and trade and communal ceremony rather than military coercion. It was an alternative model of how cities could work. This interpretation has been influential and also contested. Some researchers have argued that the absence of defensive architecture reflects geographical isolation rather than cultural pacifism. Caral was surrounded by desert, with the ocean to the west and the Andes to the east, and may simply have had no neighbors capable of threatening it militarily during its period of florescence. Others have pointed to evidence of social hierarchy in the differential size and quality of residential structures, arguing that the organization capable of constructing Caral's platform mounds almost certainly involved forms of coercive authority, even if that authority was expressed through religious rather than military frameworks. And then there are the burials beneath the floors. Excavations at Corral and at related sites within the broader Norte-Chico civilization, the cultural complex of which Corral was the largest known center, have uncovered human remains interred beneath the floors of structures in ways that raise questions the peaceful civilization narrative does not easily accommodate. Some of these burials are straightforwardly funerary, individuals placed with care, accompanied by offerings, in positions consistent with respectful interment. But others are different. At certain locations within the site, skeletal remains have been found in positions and contexts that suggest something other than ordinary burial. Bodies placed in foundational contexts, beneath walls, beneath platforms, in positions that appear to be associated with the construction of the structures above them, rather than with the commemoration of the individuals themselves. The interpretation of such remains is methodologically delicate. Foundation deposits, the placement of objects, animals, or humans beneath new construction as a form of ritual consecration, are documented across numerous ancient cultures. Their presence at Corral would not make the civilization exceptional, but it would significantly complicate the picture of a society organized exclusively around peaceful ceremony and cooperative trade. The deeper excavations at subsidiary sites within the Norte Chico complex have produced evidence that is harder to accommodate within any single interpretive framework. At Aspero, a coastal site associated with the same cultural tradition as Corral, archaeologists discovered the remains of infants and young children in contexts suggesting deliberate sacrifice, interred beneath significant architectural features in ways that imply the deaths were connected to construction events or ritual occasions rather than natural mortality. The remains showed no signs of disease or malnutrition that would explain natural death, and their placement was too deliberate, too specifically associated with structural contexts, to be easily interpreted as coincidental. What does this mean for how we understand Corral? The honest answer is that it complicates it without resolving it in any clear direction. Ritual killing associated with construction or with significant ceremonial events is not incompatible with a society that was, in other respects, organized around communal cooperation and religious performance rather than military violence. The ancient world did not sort neatly into peaceful and warlike categories, and the presence of sacrificial practice does not automatically imply a society defined by brutality. But it does raise questions about the nature of the religious authority that governed Corral, who held the power to make such decisions, what cosmological framework justified them, and what the population understood to be at stake in the rituals conducted by their priests. Those questions cannot currently be answered. Corral had no writing system. The Norte Chico civilization is, in this respect, as opaque as the Indus Valley. A complex, clearly organized society that left no deciphered text explaining its own beliefs, its own mythology, its own understanding of the relationship between human life and the forces its ceremonies were designed to address. There are objects called quipas, knotted cord devices used across Andean cultures for record keeping, found at Corral in contexts suggesting they were in use as early as 2600 BC, which would make them the earliest known examples in the Americas. But the quipas of Corral have not been deciphered. The information knotted into their cords, whatever administrative, ceremonial, or narrative content they preserved, remains locked in a system whose logic has not been reconstructed. Around 2000 BC, Corral was abandoned. The process appears to have been gradual rather than sudden. A slow depopulation, possibly related to environmental stress, possibly to shifts in the coastal fishing resources that underpin the economy of the Norte Chico region. Some researchers have pointed to evidence of increased seismic activity and El Niño events during this period, disrupting the delicate balance between coastal marine resources, river valley agriculture, and the trade networks that connected Corral to the wider region. The platform mounds were not demolished. The plazas were not filled in. The city was simply left, its structures intact, its floors still covering whatever lay beneath them, its quipas disintegrating in the dry air over the centuries that followed. For roughly 4,000 years, Corral sat in the Supi Valley, essentially unknown to the wider world. The desert preserved it, the remoteness protected it, and the burials beneath its floors waited in their foundational positions, undisturbed, in the darkness beneath stones laid by people whose beliefs we cannot access, and whose decisions, about what required sacrifice, about what the earth beneath a new wall needed to be given, we cannot reconstruct from anything they left behind. What was being asked of those offerings? What did the priests of Corral believe they were purchasing with those lives, pressed into the foundations of a city that would stand for 600 years and then, quietly, return to the desert? The platform mounds are still there. The valley is still dry, and the ground beneath Corral has not finished yielding what it holds. Carol pressed its dead into its foundations and then walked away, leaving its platform mounds to the desert and its secrets to the silence of 4,000 years. Whatever the priests of the Supa Valley believed they were doing, whatever cosmological necessity they understood themselves to be serving, it died with the institutional knowledge of a civilization that left no written account of itself. We have the structures, we have the bones, we have the knotted cords whose information we cannot read, and we have the questions those things generate hanging in the dry Peruvian air without resolution. It is a pattern that keeps asserting itself in this exploration, across every continent and every era we have examined. The larger the structure, the deeper the mystery. The more deliberate the construction, the more completely its meaning has been sealed away from us. And sometimes, the structures are so large that the mystery itself was invisible for most of human history. Not because it was hidden, but because no one had yet risen high enough to see it. The basalt desert of eastern Jordan is not a landscape that invites lingering. The terrain is dark and fractured, covered in the black volcanic rock that gives the region its Arabic name, the Harit, a word that carries the sense of scorched, difficult ground. It stretches across a wide plateau east of the Jordan Valley, extending into Syria and Saudi Arabia, an environment that feels in places almost lunar. The dark stone absorbing heat through the day and releasing it slowly through the night, the vegetation sparse, the horizon featureless. It is, by most conventional measures, a marginal landscape, one that human communities have passed through and occasionally settled in, but never transformed into a center of anything the wider world remembers. Or so it seemed, until satellite imagery began to reveal what was written across its surface. Among the desert kites we explored earlier in this journey, those vast hunting structures visible only from altitude, stretching across Arabia in their thousands, a different category of structure began to emerge in aerial and satellite survey. Circular, geometric, precise in ways that the functional irregularity of hunting traps does not require. Stone rings, some simple and some elaborately constructed, appearing across the Jordanian basalt desert and the surrounding region in numbers and configurations that researchers are still working to fully document and understand. These are sometimes called the big circles, a deliberately neutral term that reflects the honest state of knowledge about them. Approximately 20 of these structures have been identified in Jordan and the broader region, with additional examples emerging as satellite survey coverage improves. They are large, typically between 220 and 500 meters in diameter, constructed from low stone walls that rise no more than a meter or so above the desert surface. From ground level, standing inside one, you would have no clear sense of its shape. The walls are too low to enclose meaningfully, too low to defend against anything, too low to serve as the foundation for a roof or any substantial superstructure. They do not look like much, standing among them. From above, they are extraordinary. The precision of their circularity is, by the standards of the tools available to their builders, remarkable. Analysis of the structures has shown that their circularity is not approximate. These are not rough rings thrown together without careful measurement. They are geometrically consistent in a way that implies either sophisticated surveying techniques or an iterative construction process refined enough to produce near-perfect circles across diameters of several hundred meters. For the period in which they appear to have been built, Preliminary dating suggests some of these structures may be as old as 2,000 to 4,000 years, with uncertainty at both ends of that range. This level of geometric precision is not something to be assumed. It is something to be explained. And the explanations are, at present, genuinely limited. The dating of the Jordanian big circles is one of the central problems in their study. Unlike sites with organic material amenable to radiocarbon dating or artifacts that can be placed within known typological sequences, these structures are built entirely from surface stone, arranged without mortar, and contain almost no associated material culture that would allow confident dating. Researchers working with aerial survey data and limited ground investigation have proposed date ranges that span several thousand years, with different structures potentially belonging to different periods. The possibility that the big circles were not all built by the same culture, in the same period, for the same purpose, cannot be excluded. What can be said is that they appear to predate, in most cases, the Islamic period, and that the local populations encountered by early 20th century travelers and administrators in the region had no preserved tradition explaining their construction or purpose. They were simply there, as they had always been, without a story attached to them. The absence of local explanatory tradition is itself significant. For structures of this scale to exist without oral tradition, without inherited knowledge of their builders or their meaning, implies either a very long gap between their construction and the arrival of the current cultural memory in the region, or a deliberate silence, a tradition of not speaking about what they were, which in the ancient world could itself be a form of sacred protection. Researchers have proposed several functional explanations. Corrals for livestock, constructed by pastoral communities managing large herds across the basalt plateau, is one possibility. But the scale of the structure seems excessive for practical animal management, and their geometric precision serves no obvious functional purpose in that context. Gathering places for seasonal communities, used for ceremonies or assemblies of a kind that left no other archaeological trace, is another suggestion. Astronomical markers, oriented to celestial phenomena in ways not yet fully analyzed, have also been proposed, though systematic archaeoastronomical study of the big circles has not yet been conducted at the level of detail that would allow confident conclusions. The connection to the desert kites of the same region is a relationship that researchers have noted without yet fully explaining. The kite structures and the big circles share a landscape, share a construction material, and share the quality of being visible primarily or exclusively from above. Whether they were built by the same people in the same period as part of a broader tradition of landscape-scale construction, or whether they represent different cultures using the same abundant raw material for entirely different purposes, is a question the current evidence does not resolve. There is a broader observation that the big circles invite, sitting within the context of everything this exploration has examined. Across the ancient world, from the Nabta Playa stone circle in the Egyptian desert, to the circular plan of Archaeum on the Eurasian steppe, to the sunken circular plazas of Corral in coastal Peru, there is a recurring human impulse toward the circle as the organizing geometry of sacred or significant space. The circle appears, independently, in cultures separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, as the form that something important takes. Whether this reflects a deep cognitive universality, something about the circle that human minds across all cultures recognize as meaningful, or whether it represents connections and transmissions we have not yet traced, is one of the larger unanswered questions in the study of ancient human behavior. The Jordanian big circles fit this pattern. They are large enough to have served as gathering places for substantial communities. They are precise enough to have been constructed with care and intention over a significant period of time. They are positioned in a landscape that, while harsh, was not uninhabited. The desert kites in the same region demonstrate that the people who lived and moved through the Heret were capable of large-scale, organized landscape modification. But who, specifically, built the big circles? When? For what purpose? Did they use them seasonally, returning year after year to a fixed circular space for ceremonies whose content we cannot reconstruct? Did they understand the circle as cosmologically significant, as a model of the sky, a contained world, a space set apart from the ordinary landscape by its geometry. Did they know, standing inside the low walls, that the full meaning of what they had built was visible only from a perspective they could never themselves occupy? Ground survey of several big circle sites has produced almost no artifacts. No burned layers suggesting repeated fire use, no dense accumulations of bones suggesting feasting, no burials. Almost nothing that the ordinary tools of archaeology can grip and date and interpret. The structures exist. The builders do not. Somewhere in the dark basalt of the Jordanian plateau, written in stone circles that were already ancient when the first known traveler passed through this landscape and failed to record them, there is a question about what human communities in this region understood a circle to mean, and what they believed happened inside one. We are still, in the most literal sense, circling it. The builders of the Jordanian big circles constructed their geometry in stone and then withdrew, leaving no name, no explanation, no tradition that survived to tell the cultures who came after them what the circles meant or what had happened inside them. They built at a scale that required community, at a precision that required knowledge, and at a remove from ordinary utility that required belief. And all three of those things departed with them, as completely as if they had never existed. It is a particular kind of erasure, not the erasure of destruction, where the physical evidence is damaged or removed. The erasure of silence, where the objects remain, perfectly preserved, and the meaning has simply gone. Across the ancient world, that silence takes many forms. Sometimes it is the silence of an undeciphered script, language present but unreadable. Sometimes it is the silence of a missing archive, records that existed and did not survive. And sometimes it is the silence of objects so large and so numerous, and so completely without written context, that they stand in the landscape like questions given physical form. Present, undeniable, and absolutely uncommunicative about their own significance. In the mountains of central Laos, on a high plateau where the air is cool and the morning mist settles into the valleys with a slow deliberateness that makes the landscape feel suspended between states. There are jars, not small jars, not decorative vessels displayed in a sheltered space. Stone jars, carved from solid rock, standing in open fields across the plateau in clusters that range from a handful to several hundred. The largest of them are taller than a grown adult, some exceeding 2.5 meters in height, and weigh several tons. They are roughly cylindrical, wider at the body than at the mouth, their surfaces weathered by centuries of monsoon rain and dry season sun into a texture that makes them look as old as the plateau itself. Some have lids, still in place, or fallen nearby. Most do not, their openings facing the sky with an openness that feels less like incompleteness and more like invitation. There are over 2,000 of them, distributed across more than 90 sites on the Zhenghuang Plateau in northeastern Laos. They are known collectively as the Plain of Jars, a name that is both entirely accurate and somehow inadequate to convey what it feels like to stand among them. The jars were carved from several types of stone: sandstone, granite, limestone, conglomerate, quarried from sources that in some cases are located several kilometers from the sites where the jars now stand. Moving objects of this weight across the hilly terrain of the plateau, without metal tools or wheeled vehicles or draft animals capable of pulling multi-ton loads, required an engineering solution and an organizational capacity that the archaeological record of the region has not yet fully explained. The quarry sites have been identified. The transport routes have not. What the jars were used for has been debated since French researchers first documented them systematically in the 1930s. The leading archaeological interpretation, supported by excavation evidence gathered across several decades of work, interrupted significantly by the devastation of the Vietnam War era, during which the plateau became one of the most heavily bombed landscapes in human history, is funerary. Human remains have been found in association with the jars, both inside some of them and in burial pits in the surrounding ground. Cremated bone, Secondary burials, grave goods including glass and stone beads, ceramics, and iron objects have been recovered from the sites. Radiocarbon dating has placed the period of primary jar use at roughly 500 BC to 500 AD, a span of 1,000 years, during which the plateau appears to have functioned as a significant mortuary landscape for communities whose broader cultural identity and affiliations remain imperfectly understood. The people who made and used the jars have not been connected with certainty to any historically documented ethnic or political group. They left no inscriptions. Their relationship to the cultures that surrounded them, the early states of mainland Southeast Asia developing to the south and east, is unclear. The funerary interpretation is broadly supported by the evidence, but it generates more questions than it resolves. If the jars were primarily containers for the dead, or for the process of preparing the dead, perhaps as charnel vessels in which bodies were placed for initial decomposition before final burial, then their scale implies something about the importance of the dead in this culture that goes beyond ordinary mortuary practice. Jars this large, this heavy, this difficult to produce and transport represent an investment of resources and labor that in most ancient societies is reserved for the most significant purposes. Every jar on the plateau is, in a sense, a statement about the person it commemorated, about the community's relationship with death, about the beliefs that made this particular form of memorialization necessary rather than merely conventional. But the jars vary enormously in size, and the significance of that variation has not been established. Were the largest jars reserved for the highest status individuals? For multiple burials? For a different purpose entirely? The evidence from excavation does not yet produce a clear hierarchy of jar size to social status or to specific burial practice. The variation may be meaningful. It may be practical. It may reflect different periods of manufacture within the 1,000-year span of use. No one knows with confidence. Local oral traditions offer a different kind of answer, one that archaeology neither confirms nor dismisses. Communities in the Zhenghuang region have preserved stories describing the jars as the creation of a legendary giant king named Kun Chung, who commissioned them to brew and store enormous quantities of rice wine to celebrate a great military victory. In this tradition, the jars are vessels of celebration rather than vessels of death, containers for the fermented abundance of a triumphant moment, scaled to the dimensions of a heroic age. The story is clearly legendary in its framing. But legends, as this entire exploration has repeatedly demonstrated, sometimes preserve a distorted memory of something real. The association of large stone vessels with the storage of fermented substances, echoing perhaps the ritual drink traditions we encountered at Gonur Tepe and in the Vedic and Avestan Hauma traditions, is not inherently implausible as a partial explanation. Some researchers have proposed that the jars may have served multiple purposes across their long history of use. First as storage vessels for liquids or foodstuffs, then repurposed or co-opted for funerary use as the culture that made them evolved, or as new populations brought different practices to the same landscape. This multi-use hypothesis is speculative, but not unreasonable. Objects of significant size and durability are rarely monofunctional across 1,000 years of use by communities whose needs and beliefs shift over generations. Then there are the discs, large circular stone objects found at several jar sites, lying on the ground near the jars, whose purpose is even less clearly established than the jars themselves. Some researchers have suggested they served as lids, covers placed over the jars at specific moments in their use. Others have proposed they were markers, gravestones essentially, placed horizontally rather than vertically in a tradition different from the upright commemorative stones found in other ancient cultures. The discs have received far less analytical attention than the jars, and their significance remains almost entirely open. The damage inflicted on the plain of jars during the bombing campaigns of the 1960s and 1970s complicates the archaeological picture in ways that are difficult to fully assess. An estimated 2 million tons of ordnance were dropped on Laos during this period, more, per capita, than any country in history. The plateau was directly affected. Some jars were destroyed. Others were displaced. The ground surrounding many sites is still contaminated with unexploded ordnance, which has limited the scope of systematic excavation and surface survey in ways that may never be fully remedied. Archaeology is conducted in the gaps between bomb craters, around areas that cannot safely be dug. The full picture of what the Plain of Jars represents, what culture produced it, what beliefs animated it, what the thousand-year history of its use actually contained, is being assembled from incomplete evidence in a landscape that the 20th century damaged in ways the original builders could not have imagined. 2,000 jars, standing in the mountain mist of central Laos. Each one carved by hand from solid rock, moved across difficult terrain by methods we have not reconstructed, placed in positions whose logic we have only partially understood, used for purposes that the people who used them never wrote down. What was placed inside them at the beginning, before the dead arrived? And what did the plateau look like on the days when the jars were new, when the stone was fresh, and the people who made them were still present to explain what they meant? The jars of the Zhenghuang Plateau stand in their mountain mist, carved from solid rock and moved across difficult terrain by methods we have not reconstructed, used across 1,000 years of human activity that left almost no written trace of itself. Whatever the people of the Plain of Jars believed about death, whatever cosmological framework made the construction of 2-ton stone vessels a necessary and appropriate response to mortality, it dissolved with the culture that held it, leaving only the objects behind. Present, massive, and silent. There is a particular quality to the silence of burial objects. They were made in almost every case for the dead. Objects whose purpose was oriented toward a transition, toward a moment of passage, toward whatever the living believed happened after life ended. They carry intention in their very existence. Someone made them deliberately, placed them deliberately, sealed them away from the ordinary world deliberately. And that deliberateness gives them a weight beyond their physical dimensions, a sense that they are still doing something, even now, even emptied of the specific belief system that gave them meaning. Nowhere is that quality more present than in the burial masks. The steppe country north and west of the Black Sea is a landscape of enormous horizontal distances. Grassland that rolls without interruption from the Carpathian foothills eastward into the Eurasian interior, crossed by rivers that move slowly through the flat terrain, the sky above it larger and more present than in almost any other inhabited landscape on Earth. This is the Pontic Steppe, one of the great corridors of human movement in prehistoric and historic times, the route along which populations, languages, technologies, and ideas flowed between the European West and the Asian East across thousands of years. It is the landscape from which, most linguists now believe, the Proto-Indo-European language spread outward to eventually become the ancestor of nearly half the world's languages. It is also a landscape of kurgans. Kurgans are burial mounds, earthen tumuli raised over the graves of the dead, a tradition that appears on the Pontic Steppe as early as the 4th millennium BC and persists, in various forms, across a time span of several thousand years. They dot the steppe horizon in their thousands, low swellings in the grassland that the eye eventually learns to read as human rather than geological. Too regular, too rounded, too consistently positioned on high ground overlooking river valleys to be natural formations. Many have been excavated, producing remarkable assemblages of grave goods that have illuminated the cultures of the steppe in ways that would otherwise be entirely inaccessible. The Yamnaya culture, the catacomb culture, the Shrubna culture, these Bronze Age steppe societies are known primarily through their kurgans, through what they chose to place with their dead and how they chose to arrange them. Among the most striking objects recovered from certain kurgan burials are the masks. They are not universal. They do not appear in every burial or every cultural phase, but across a range of sites associated primarily with the catacomb culture, a Bronze Age steppe society that flourished roughly between 2800 and 1800 BC, contemporary with the height of Corral, with the late Indus Valley cities, with the early phases of Archame. Excavators have found clay masks placed over or near the faces of the dead. Some were molded directly onto the faces of the deceased before the clay hardened, creating death casts that preserve in 3 dimensions the facial structure of individuals who lived 4,000 years ago. Others were modeled more generally, representing a face without being a specific portrait, idealized or typological, or shaped to represent something other than the literal appearance of the person they accompanied. The clay is usually ochre-stained, the red mineral pigment that appears in burial contexts across an extraordinary range of prehistoric cultures, on nearly every inhabited continent, across a time span of tens of thousands of years. The significance of ochre in prehistoric burial is one of the genuine puzzles of human symbolic behavior. Its use is so widespread, so persistent, and so consistently associated with the dead that it clearly meant something profound and recurring to the human communities that employed it. And yet what it meant, specifically, in any given cultural context, cannot be reconstructed from the archaeological evidence alone. The catacomb culture masks have been interpreted in several ways. The most straightforward reading treats them as a form of commemoration, a desire to preserve the appearance of the dead individual, to maintain their presence in a form that the living could keep, or visit, or address. This impulse is recognizable across cultures. The death masks of ancient Egypt, the plaster skulls of Neolithic Jericho, the commemorative portraits of Roman aristocrats, all represent variations on the same fundamental human resistance to the complete physical disappearance of the significant dead. But some of the catacomb masks complicate the commemorative interpretation. Several have been found not placed over the face of the buried individual but positioned nearby, beside the head or at the feet, or placed against the wall of the burial chamber in ways that suggest they function less as portraits and more as objects with independent agency, as if the mask was not a representation of the dead person, but a container for something, a vessel for an aspect of the self that survived death and required a physical home. This interpretation resonates with what is known about the broader religious and cosmological framework of steppe Bronze Age cultures, insofar as anything is known about it, which is less than we would wish. The steppe cultures left no written records. Their beliefs must be reconstructed from burial practice, from the orientation of graves relative to the sun and the cardinal directions, from the animal remains and weapons and ornaments placed with the dead, and from the structural features of the kurgan itself, the way the burial chamber was built, sealed, and mounded over, creating a small constructed world within the earth. Some researchers, working from comparative analysis of later Indo-Iranian religious traditions, the same traditions whose roots we traced back to the Sintashta culture at Archaeum and the Oxus priests of Bactria Margiana, have proposed that the catacomb masks reflect a belief in the separability of the self. The idea that a person consists of multiple components, some of which survive death in different ways and require different ritual accommodations, is present in early Vedic thought, in early Iranian cosmology, and in the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European religious framework that both traditions inherited. A mask that houses one aspect of the dead while the body houses another is not, within such a framework, a strange or contradictory object. It is a practical response to a specific theological understanding. This remains interpretive rather than evidential. The connection between the catacomb culture and the later Indo-Iranian traditions that provide the comparative framework is plausible given the geographic and chronological relationships, but it is not established with the certainty that would allow confident theological reconstruction. What is established is the craft. The catacomb masks are not crude or hasty objects. They are made with care. Their surfaces sometimes incised with geometric patterns, their features modeled with an attention to detail that implies the maker understood the face they were rendering and considered the work important. Some carry traces of pigment beyond the ochre, colors applied to specific features in ways that suggest the mask was not simply a neutral representation, but was decorated according to a system of symbolic meaning that determined which colors went where. Geometric incisions on several masks have drawn particular attention. Repeated patterns, chevrons, spirals, parallel lines that appear on the masks also appear on other objects from catacomb culture contexts, suggesting a shared visual vocabulary whose specific meanings remain undeciphered. Whether these patterns were decorative, identifying, protective, or cosmologically meaningful in ways that connected the individual mask to a wider system of belief is a question the patterns themselves cannot answer. Some of the most recently excavated catacomb burial sites have produced masks in association with other objects whose combination is difficult to interpret within any single functional framework. Miniature wheeled vehicles, animal figurines, objects that appear to be models of things rather than the things themselves. A burial equipped with models, of carts, of animals, of household items, implies a belief about what the dead need in the place they are going, and a theology about what that place is like. The masks fit within this framework as models of something too, not the face itself, but whatever the face stood for in a context where the distinction between a person and their representation required careful ritual management. 4,000 years after they were sealed into the dark of their burial chambers, the masks have come back into the light. They were made to accompany the dead into whatever came next. They were not made to be looked at by the living, in museum cases and archaeological reports, by people from cultures whose relationship with death bears almost no resemblance to the framework that produced them. What did the person who shaped each mask believe they were doing? What were they protecting? The dead from something, or the living from the dead, or something in between from the ordinary passage of time? The steppe stretches out around the kurgans, as wide and as patient as it has always been. The masks have all the time in the world to keep their answer. The copper mines of Timna hold their oldest secrets in the deepest layers. The Chalcolithic miners who first cut into that colored rock, working a knowledge so specialized and so dependent on direct transmission that its interruption meant its loss, leaving the valley to be rediscovered rather than remembered by those who came after. There is something both poignant and instructive about that pattern. The most practical, most material knowledge, how to do something specific with something physical, can be just as fragile as the most abstract belief. Both require living chains of transmission. Both can be broken. And when they break, what remains are objects without explanation. Tools whose purpose is recognizable in general terms, but whose specific context has vanished. Artifacts that tell you something was done, without telling you by whom, or why, or how the knowledge of doing it was held and passed, and eventually lost. Sometimes those objects appear in places where they have no business being. In the interior of Oman, away from the coastline, in terrain that has been desert or semi-arid scrubland for longer than recorded history extends, there are stone anchors. Not one or two. Not the isolated curiosity that might be explained by a single unusual event. Stone anchors in numbers, at sites that sit kilometers from the nearest navigable water, in landscape that the sea has not reached within any time frame that ordinary geological or climatic explanation easily accommodates. Large perforated stones, shaped and drilled with the deliberateness of objects made for a specific purpose, sitting in terrain where that purpose seems, on the face of it, entirely impossible. The anchor is among the most functionally specific objects a maritime culture produces. Unlike a vessel, which can be repurposed, unlike a rope, which serves many uses, an anchor has one job. It holds a floating thing in place against the movement of water. Its design, the weight, the perforation for the road, the shape that allows it to grip the bottom, is calibrated for an aquatic environment. Finding one far from water is not simply puzzling. It is, in the most literal sense, an object out of place. Oman's relationship with the sea is ancient and profound. The Omani coastline stretches along the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman in a long arc that provided, in antiquity, one of the most strategically positioned maritime interfaces in the ancient world. A natural gateway between the Persian Gulf trade networks we have already explored, the Indian Ocean routes that connected the Arabian Peninsula to the Indian subcontinent and the East African coast, and the overland routes that crossed the Arabian interior toward Mesopotamia and the Levant. The ancient region of Magan, identified by most researchers with modern Oman and the UAE, was precisely the copper-producing and maritime trading intermediary that the Mesopotamian tablets record with such commercial specificity. Omani sailors and merchants were moving across the Indian Ocean at least as early as the 3rd millennium BC, in vessels whose construction and navigational methods we have only partially reconstructed. The maritime heritage of Oman is not in question. What is in question is what stone anchors are doing inland. The sites where inland anchors have been documented range across different parts of Oman's interior, associated in some cases with ancient caravan routes, and in others with locations whose relationship to any known trade or transit corridor is not immediately obvious. The anchors themselves vary in size and in the sophistication of their drilling. Some are relatively simple perforated stones. Others show a level of craft in their shaping that implies they were purpose-made rather than opportunistically modified from available material. Several explanations have been proposed, each plausible in some respects and problematic in others. The most geologically conservative interpretation appeals to sea level change and coastal transformation. The Arabian coastline has not been static across the millennia. Sea levels during the early Holocene, the period following the last glacial maximum, roughly 10,000 to 6,000 years ago, were significantly higher than today in some regions, and the geography of the Gulf of Oman's coastal margins was correspondingly different. If certain inland areas of Oman were at or near navigable water during an earlier period of higher sea levels or different hydrological conditions, anchors found there might represent maritime activity at a time when the landscape itself was different, when what is now dry interior was then coastal or accessible by river or inlet. This explanation has geological plausibility in principle, but has not been confirmed with the specificity required to account for all of the inland anchor sites. The sea level changes of the Holocene, while real, do not straightforwardly explain anchors at all of the documented inland locations, some of which sit at elevations and in terrain configurations that would require coastal conditions very different from anything the current geological record clearly supports for the relevant periods. A second category of explanation focuses on the anchors as votive or ritual objects rather than functional maritime equipment. Across the ancient world, objects associated with the sea and with navigation carried powerful symbolic weight for cultures whose survival depended on maritime activity. Ships' anchors, in particular, carried meaning beyond their function. In later Mediterranean cultures, the anchor became a symbol of hope, of stability, of connection to safety. The practice of depositing anchors at sacred sites, at inland shrines, at locations connected to the protection of sailors and voyages, is documented in ancient Mediterranean contexts, where stone and lead anchors have been found at temple sites far from navigable water, dedicated as offerings by sailors grateful for safe return or seeking divine protection for future voyages. If a similar votive tradition existed among Oman's ancient maritime communities, and given the antiquity and intensity of Omani seafaring, such a tradition would not be surprising. Then inland anchors might represent not stranded maritime equipment, but deliberate religious deposits. Objects carried from the coast to specific inland sacred sites and left there as part of practices whose full context we have not yet reconstructed. This interpretation is attractive, but also circular in a methodological sense. We are proposing a religious practice to explain objects whose presence requires explanation, without independent evidence of the practice itself. The anchors become evidence for the ritual, and the ritual becomes the explanation for the anchors, in a loop that requires external corroboration to break. The third category of explanation is the one that mainstream archaeology treats with the most caution, but that the physical evidence in some cases seems most directly to suggest. That some of these anchors were used as anchors, in contexts involving water bodies or hydrological conditions that no longer exist in the interior of Oman, and whose disappearance is itself part of the mystery. The broader Arabian Peninsula experienced dramatic hydrological transformation between approximately 6000 and 2000 BC as the African humid period. The same climatic event that had sustained the Nabta Playa civilization and the Green Sahara withdrew, leaving behind increasingly arid conditions across a region that had previously supported rivers, lakes, and seasonal wetlands of significant extent. Wadi systems that once carried permanent or semi-permanent water flows dried into the intermittent flood channels that characterize the Arabian interior today. Lake basins that held water for thousands of years became salt flats. The transformation was gradual on a human timescale, but profound in its cumulative effect on the landscape. If certain wadi systems in Oman's interior carried navigable water, or connected to coastal inlets that penetrated further inland than they do today, during the period when Omani maritime culture was at its most active and most materially rich, then anchors in those interior locations might reflect riverine or estuarine activity in a landscape that has since been transformed beyond recognition. The water that justified the anchors dried up. The anchors, made of stone and therefore immune to the processes of decay that consumed the wooden vessels and organic equipment they accompanied, remained. The boats rotted. The ropes dissolved. The sailors died and were buried or not buried, and became part of the landscape. The stones stayed. There is a version of the ancient world that existed along Oman's interior waterways, a version where the wadi floors carried boats as well as seasonal floods, where the copper of Magan moved by water through routes that are now dry rock and gravel, where the maritime networks we associate exclusively with the open sea extended their logic and their equipment deep into terrain that today seems to belong entirely to the desert. That version of the ancient world left stone anchors as its evidence. It left almost nothing else. Who was navigating Oman's interior, and by what waterways, before the climate took those waterways away? And what else did they leave behind, in locations that the drying of the landscape has since made as unlikely as anchors in a desert? The stones are still there, patient and perforated, waiting for a water that stopped coming thousands of years ago. The stone anchors of Oman's interior wait in terrain that the water abandoned thousands of years ago. Objects perfectly calibrated for an environment that no longer exists around them, patient and perforated and entirely out of place. They are evidence of a world we cannot fully reconstruct, a version of the ancient Arabian interior that the climate erased so thoroughly that only the most durable objects survived to testify that it existed at all. There is something in that image, the anchor without water, the maritime tool stranded in desert, that captures something essential about the challenge of understanding the deep past. The objects survive. The context that gave them meaning does not. And without context, even the most legible object becomes opaque. An anchor tells you everything about what it did and nothing about who held the rope. But what about objects that are less legible than anchors? Objects whose very nature is communicative, whose purpose was, from the moment of their creation, to convey meaning from one mind to another, and yet whose message, 4,000 years after they were made, has still not been read. The village of Tartaria sits in the Mureș River Valley of western Romania, in a region of gentle hills and agricultural land that has been continuously inhabited since the Neolithic period. It is not a dramatic landscape. It does not announce itself, the kind of place that the historical imagination tends to skip over on its way to the Mediterranean civilizations to the south and the east, the cultures that produce the monuments and the written records and the canonical narratives of Western history. In 1961, a Romanian archaeologist named Nicolae Vlasa was excavating a Neolithic site near the village when he uncovered something that would insert this quiet corner of Transylvania into one of the most heated debates in the history of ancient writing. In a pit, alongside the burned and fragmented bones of a human adult, Vlasa found 3 small clay tablets. 2 were rectangular, 1 was circular with a hole at its center. All 3 were inscribed, marked with signs that had been pressed or incised into the clay before firing. The signs were not random. They were organized. Some appeared in groups, separated from other groups by lines. They were repeated across the tablets in ways that suggested a system rather than decoration, a controlled use of a limited set of symbols, arranged according to rules that the marks themselves did not explain. The tablets were assigned by radiocarbon dating, conducted on the bone material found with them, to approximately 5300 BC. That date, if accurate, place the Tartaria tablets more than 1,000 years before the earliest Sumerian writing in Mesopotamia, which most historians have long treated as the origin point of human writing. If the signs on the tablets constituted writing, or proto-writing, or any form of symbolic communication more structured than decorative marking, then the conventional story of how and where writing began would require fundamental revision. The implications were significant enough that the Tartaria tablets became, almost immediately after their publication, a subject of intense scholarly controversy that has not subsided in the 6 decades since. The first and most fundamental question is whether the tablets were actually made at the time the associated bones were deposited, or whether they represent intrusive material, objects from a later period that ended up in a context that produced anomalously early radiocarbon dates. The pit in which Vlasa found the tablets was not, by the standards of modern excavation, meticulously documented. The stratigraphic context was ambiguous enough that subsequent researchers have questioned whether the tablets and the bones were genuinely contemporary deposits or the result of later disturbance mixing different chronological layers. This is not a trivial objection. Archaeological context is everything when the claim being made is as extraordinary as the world's oldest writing, and a compromised context significantly weakens the evidential basis for that claim. The question of whether the signs constitute writing at all is equally unresolved. Writing, in the strict sense used by most linguists and historians, requires a systematic correspondence between visual signs and linguistic units. Sounds, syllables, words, or some combination. The signs on the Tartaria tablets are too few and their internal logic too opaque to demonstrate this kind of systematic correspondence. They could represent a proto-writing system, a set of symbols used to record information without fully encoding spoken language. They could represent ownership marks or counting symbols of the kind found on objects across the ancient Near East long before the development of full writing. They could represent something with religious or ritual significance that operated entirely outside the domain of linguistic recording. Or they could represent a system of genuine writing whose language we have not identified and whose code we have not broken. The visual similarity between some of the Tartaria signs and certain Sumerian pictographs from the Uruk period, the late 4th millennium BC, roughly 2,000 years after the dated Tartaria context, has fueled two opposite interpretations. For researchers who believe the tablets represent an early indigenous European writing tradition, the similarity suggests that Mesopotamian writing may have had roots in or connections to a much older symbolic tradition in southeastern Europe, a possibility that would overturn the conventional east-to-west narrative of civilization's spread. For skeptics, the similarity suggests instead that the tablets are not as old as the radiocarbon dates suggest, that they represent Neolithic Balkan contact with or derivation from Near Eastern symbolic systems at a period much closer to the Sumerian material than the 5300 BC date implies. The Tartaria tablets belong to the Vinca culture, a Neolithic civilization that extended across much of the Balkans and Central Europe from roughly 5700 to 4500 BC, known for its distinctive ceramic art, its settled village life, its copper use, and, crucially, for a recurring set of symbolic marks found on objects across a wide geographic area. The Vinca symbols, of which the Tartaria inscriptions are among the most complex examples, have been found on figurines, ceramics, and weights across hundreds of sites. They appear with sufficient consistency to suggest a shared symbolic tradition, a visual vocabulary used across a large cultural area over a period of more than 1,000 years. Whether this visual vocabulary constitutes a writing system, a proto-writing system, a set of potter's marks, a collection of religious symbols, or some combination of these things, is the central unresolved question of Vinca symbol studies. Attempts at decipherment have been made by researchers working from a variety of linguistic and methodological frameworks, and none has achieved acceptance. The symbols remain, after more than 60 years of study, fundamentally unread. What makes the Tartaria tablets specifically rather than just generally mysterious is the context in which they were found. The burned human bones in the pit with them, adult bones, fragmented, apparently burned before deposition, have led some researchers to propose that the tablets were associated with a ritual event, possibly sacrificial in nature, in which the tablets played a specific ceremonial role. If they were made to accompany the dead, if the signs on them represented something that the deceased needed to carry into whatever came after, or something that the living needed to record at the moment of death or sacrifice, then they occupy the same category as the catacomb burial masks and the Corral Foundation deposits we encountered earlier. Objects created specifically for a threshold moment, communicating something about the relationship between the living and the dead that the symbols alone cannot convey to us. There is also the question of who made them and what making them involved. Producing inscribed clay tablets implies at minimum a decision to record something, an understanding that marks on a surface can carry and transmit meaning beyond the moment of their creation. Whether that understanding was widespread in the Vinca culture or restricted to a specialized group, priests, administrators, a scribal class of some kind, is unknown. The distribution of Vinca symbols across mundane objects like pottery suggests broad familiarity with at least some of the marks. The concentration of complex inscriptions like those on the Tartaria tablets suggests that the most elaborate use of the symbol system was rarer, more significant, more carefully controlled. The tablets were fired, hardened by heat in a way that preserved them across 7,000 years of burial. Whether they were fired deliberately to preserve them or as part of the ritual event that placed them in the pit is another question the evidence cannot resolve. They were made to communicate something. They were placed with someone dead or sacrificed. They were sealed underground for 7 millennia. They were found, studied, debated, and not decoded. The signs are still there, on 3 small pieces of clay from a Transylvanian pit, waiting for the particular mind that will finally understand what they were always trying to say. What message was so important that it needed to be pressed into clay and placed with the dead? And what does it mean that 7,000 years later, we still cannot read it? The catacomb masks were sealed into the earth with their dead, equipped to accompany a transition that the living could not follow and could not fully understand. They were made with care for a journey whose destination the makers believed in completely and described to us not at all. 4,000 years later, we hold them in the light and recognize the intention without being able to read it. The shape of profound belief, emptied of its specific content. But burial and belief are not the only things the ancient world sealed into the earth. Sometimes what was buried was more practical, more extractable, more consequential in the most immediate material sense for every civilization that came after. The Timna Valley opens in the southern Arabah, the long dry rift that runs between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba, in terrain that belongs today to the southernmost tip of the modern state that was historically part of the broader land of Canaan and the ancient Near Eastern world. The valley is a place of violent geological color. The sandstone cliffs that rise on either side shift through registers of red and ochre and purple as the light changes through the day. And at their center, rising from the valley floor like a natural monument, stands a column of rock the color of dried blood, eroded into a shape so distinct that it has carried the same name for centuries. Solomon's Pillars. Dramatic, ancient, completely indifferent to the human activity that has swirled around its base for thousands of years. Beneath the valley floor and within the sandstone formations that flank it lies copper ore, malachite and chalcopyrite and chrysocolla staining the rock green and blue and turquoise, visible in the cliff faces, extractable with the right tools, processable with sufficient heat and knowledge into the metal that defined the technological horizon of the Bronze Age. Copper was not merely useful in the ancient world. It was, for several millennia, the difference between a society that could equip its workers and warriors with durable metal tools and weapons and a society that could not. Control of copper sources was, in the most fundamental sense, a form of geopolitical power. Timna was one of the ancient world's significant copper sources. That much is not disputed. What is disputed, what remains one of the more quietly contentious questions in the archaeology of the southern Levant, is who mined it, when, and under what organizational framework, and what happened to them. Excavations at Timna, conducted most extensively by the Israeli archaeologist Beno Rothenberg beginning in the 1960s, revealed a mining and smelting operation of considerable scale and long duration. The physical evidence of ancient copper production is extensive. Mining shafts cut into the sandstone, smelting sites with slag heaps that represent the residue of thousands of individual smelting events, tools, ceramics, and other material culture distributed across the valley in patterns that reflect organized industrial activity, rather than casual or occasional extraction. Rothenberg's initial interpretation assigned the primary period of intensive copper production at Timna to the New Kingdom Egyptian period, roughly 1300 to 1150 BC, on the basis of Egyptian artifacts and cartouches found at the site, including a temple to the goddess Hathor that Egyptian miners or their overseers had constructed and used. On this reading, Timna was an Egyptian industrial operation, staffed by a combination of Egyptian administrators and local workers, possibly including people from the indigenous populations of the Arabah and Negev regions, producing copper under the organizational umbrella of the Egyptian state. This interpretation shaped the understanding of Timna for decades. It was tidy, well supported by the Egyptian material culture at the site, and fit within a broader picture of New Kingdom Egypt's reach into the resource zones of its periphery. But subsequent excavations have complicated the picture significantly. Recent work at the site, particularly excavations led by Erez Ben Yosef of Tel Aviv University in the 2010s, has pushed back the intensive use of Timna's copper resources into an earlier period and critically has produced evidence for sophisticated copper production at the site during the 10th century BC, a period that corresponds, in the traditional chronology, with the era of the early Israelite monarchy. The identification of this later phase of activity has reopened debates about the historical background of the Solomonic narratives in Hebrew scripture. Whether the copper wealth associated with the early monarchy in biblical accounts might reflect actual large-scale metal production in the Arabah, including Timna. Hence the popular designation, sometimes applied to the broader region, as Solomon's Mines. This connection is contested and complicated by the political and religious weight that the Solomonic narrative carries, a weight that can distort archaeological interpretation in both directions, toward credulity and toward excessive skepticism. The archaeology at Timna does not confirm or deny the biblical accounts. It demonstrates that sophisticated, large-scale copper production occurred in the region during the relevant period, conducted by a social organization capable of managing complex industrial processes in a harsh desert environment. What that social organization was, and how it related to the political entities described in ancient texts, remains a matter of active and sometimes heated debate. But the mystery that sits beneath all of these debates, beneath the Egyptian phase and the 10th century phase, and the question of Solomonic connections, is older than any of them. Before the Egyptians arrived, before the 10th century operations, before the historical periods that can be cross-referenced with textual sources, there was mining at Timna. The earliest copper extraction at the site dates to the Chalcolithic period. The Copper Age, the transitional era between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, reaching back as far as the 5th millennium BC. This is mining conducted by people for whom copper was not yet the industrial staple it would become, for whom the technology of metal extraction and processing was new and experimental, and, perhaps, still embedded in frameworks of meaning that had not yet been separated from the practical. Who these earliest miners were, what social organization they belonged to, what motivated them to work copper in one of the most inhospitable valleys in the southern Levant, what they did with the metal they produced, is almost entirely unknown. They left tools. They left evidence of fire. They left the physical marks of their extraction in the rock. They did not leave anything that explains them. Between the Chalcolithic activity and the New Kingdom Egyptian phase, the record at Timna is intermittent and unclear, periods of apparent activity alternating with periods of apparent abandonment, the attribution of specific phases to specific cultural groups uncertain, the organizational frameworks behind the different periods of production not yet reconstructed with confidence. There is also the question of knowledge transmission. Copper smelting is not an intuitive technology. It requires specific knowledge of ore types, of the temperatures required for reduction, of the fluxes needed to separate metal from slag, of the construction and management of furnaces capable of sustaining the required heat. This knowledge, once developed in a specific location with specific ores, tends to be transmitted through practice, through the direct teaching of people who know to people who are learning. When a mining tradition is interrupted, the specialized knowledge it embodied does not automatically persist. It can be lost, requiring rediscovery rather than recovery when activity resumes. The gaps in Timna's occupation record may therefore represent not merely demographic absences, periods when no one was living and working in the valley, but epistemological ones. Periods when the knowledge of how to work the valley's copper efficiently had to be reconstructed by people who may not have known what their predecessors knew, working from the physical evidence of previous activity without access to the specific expertise that had produced it. This is a human story as much as an archaeological one. The valley's copper did not change across the millennia. What changed was the human capacity and organizational will to extract it. And that capacity, it turns out, was fragile, dependent on specific chains of knowledge transmission and specific configurations of social organization that could be broken by disruption, depopulation, political collapse, or simply the departure of the people who knew what to do. The sandstone cliffs of Timna still carry their green and blue mineral stains. Solomon's pillars still rise from the valley floor in their geological indifference. The slag heaps of ancient smelting operations are still there, the glassy residue of metal separated from rock by people whose names and beliefs and organizational frameworks we have largely lost. What did the earliest miners believe about the colored stone they were cutting from the cliff face? What did copper mean, not economically but spiritually, symbolically, to the people who first learned to transform green rock into red metal through the application of fire? The valley holds that answer somewhere in its deep stratigraphy. We have barely begun to ask it.